The stone hit her shoulder before she even heard the footsteps. Mara Voss did not flinch. She had learned a long time ago that flinching only invited another one. She kept her eyes on the bucket in her hands and kept walking, the cold morning water sloshing against the rim, wetting the front of her worn gray shirt. The stone had not been large enough to bruise, not this time, but it had been thrown with enough force to make a point, and that was, of course, always the point. The pack of Silvercrest was not a cruel place by design. It was a place that had simply decided, long before Mara was old enough to understand decisions, that she did not belong inside its design. She was an Omega by birth, which was not unusual. Many Omegas served the pack. Their lives were quiet and often overlooked, but they were lives that had shape and meaning within the pack's structure. An Omega with a wolf was still a member of the community, still someone whose strength meant something on the longest winter nights. Mara had no wolf. That was the difference. That was the line between overlooked and invisible, between low-ranking and worthless, between belonging and simply existing in the space between. And she set the bucket down at the edge of the training yard and went back for the second one without making eye contact with the group of young warriors who had gathered near the wooden fence. She knew who had thrown the stone. She recognized the laugh. It was not her place to say so. She had tried, once, when she was 14, to report a bruise. The elder who received her complaint had written down exactly nothing and told her to be grateful she had a roof above her head. She had not reported anything since. The morning was cold and pale, the sky the color of old silver above the pine trees that circled the pack's central grounds. Silvercrest was nestled in the valley between two long ridges, and in autumn, the air carried the sharp smell of wet bark and dead leaves. It was the kind of morning that most people in the pack found beautiful. Mara found it cold. She also found the second bucket heavy. She lifted it and carried it without complaint. Wolfless. The word came from behind her, casual as a greeting. She did not answer. Answering meant engaging. Engaging meant extending the encounter. I said Wolfless. The voice belonged to Colt Renner. She knew it before she turned, but she did not turn. Colt was 24 years old and already holding the title of Beta, which meant that in the entire pack of Silvercrest, only his father, Elder Renner, and the Alpha outranked him. He had a wide, square face and pale eyes, and he wore his rank the way some men wore expensive shoes, constantly and always visible. I need those by the east yard, Colt said. The old water line is cracked. Took 2 of them over there instead. She almost said that the kitchen required both buckets by mid-morning. She almost explained that Cook Arlen had specifically asked for them. Instead, she changed direction and walked toward the east yard, carrying both buckets. This was how her mornings had worked for as long as she could remember. Instructions came from wherever they came from, often contradicting each other, and she adjusted. She rerouted. She absorbed the inconvenience without showing that it was inconvenient. Because showing it, expressing frustration, letting anything on her face suggest that she was tired, or annoyed, or hurting, would invite commentary, and commentary from people like Colt Renner was never gentle. She had been born in Silvercrest. Her mother had been born here too, and her grandmother before her. The Voss family was not new to this land. They had been here through 3 generations of alphas, through the harsh winter of the silent year, when the pack nearly starved, through the flood that took the South Quarter. They had survived everything this valley threw at them, but somewhere in the line, the wolf had stopped coming. Her grandmother had been the last to call a beast. Her mother had waited her whole life for one, and died still waiting. And Mara had learned early enough that she would wait forever, and the waiting would be the same thing as nothing. The east yard smelled of sawdust and iron. 2 workers were hammering a new section of water pipe into the frozen ground, and Mara set both buckets down where they would reach and stepped back. One of the workers nodded at her without really looking. The other did not notice her at all. She was used to that too. She turned to walk back to the kitchen and stopped. Standing in the middle of the yard, hands loose at his sides, watching the workers with the mild attention of someone who had nothing urgent to do, was a man she did not recognize. He was tall, broader than most of the warriors she saw daily, and wearing a plain gray coat that was too well made to belong to anyone in Silvercrest. The coat was the kind of thing that only a person with real money wore when they wanted to look ordinary. It almost worked. Almost. She did not stare. She looked, and then she moved. She spent the rest of the morning in the kitchen beside Cook Arlen. who was a wide, red-faced woman in her 50s, who had worked the kitchen for 30 years, and treated Mara with the closest thing to warmth that existed in the pack for her. Arlen did not offer affection the way some people did, with words and soft expressions. She offered it by teaching. She had shown Mara how to manage fire temperature, how to stretch thin ingredients into full meals, how to read the color of dough before the oven proved it right or wrong. These were small kindnesses. Mara had collected them carefully over the years, the way a person fills a jar with stones one at a time, knowing the jar will still be mostly empty for a long time. "You're distracted," Arlen said without looking up from the cutting board. "I'm fine," Mara said. "You've sliced that carrot 4 times, and it's still in one piece." Arlen glanced at the board. "What happened this morning?" Mara considered the question, the way she always considered direct questions about herself. She weighed what was honest against what was useful to say out loud. "Nothing new," she said finally. Arlen made a sound that was not quite acceptance and not quite skepticism. She went back to her work. Mara went back to the carrot. The pack's main hall began to fill by late morning, as it always did on the days approaching a formal ceremony. The awakening ceremony was 3 days away, the mid-season gathering where young pack members of 21 and above were officially inducted into the ranked structure based on the strength of their wolves. It was a noisy, joyful event for most of the pack. For Mara, it was a different kind of noise entirely. This year, she was 21. She had not expected to be included. She was not naive enough to imagine that a wolfless girl would be stood beside the others on the ceremony field and welcomed into the rank structure. That was not how things worked. She understood reality clearly enough, but understanding a thing did not make it clean. It still left a mark, the way an old bruise does, not visible on the surface but felt every time pressure was applied. She carried a tray of bread through the hall, eyes down, moving between the long tables, where warriors talked loudly and young wolves showed off their speed, racing across the flagstone floor and drawing shouts of approval. She navigated the chaos, the way she always did, by staying near the walls, by making herself small, by existing in the spaces between things. She was almost at the far door when she heard Colt's voice above the rest. "Wait," he said, and his voice had that particular tone she recognized, theatrical, performed for an audience. She kept walking. "Mara." She stopped. She turned around. Colt was standing on the low platform at the end of the hall, the one reserved for announcements. Beside him stood perhaps 30 or 40 pack members, young and not so young, all watching with the particular attention of people who expected to be entertained. Mara held the tray in both hands and kept her face very still. "I've been thinking," Colt said, with the wide smile of a person who knew the crowd was already on his side, "that the awakening ceremony this year should honor everyone, even the members who can't really participate." A ripple of laughter. "So I've talked to the elders, and we've decided that Mara Voss will walk the stone path." Silence fell, but it was not the kind of silence that precedes something serious. It was the kind that precedes laughter. Even Mara could hear the difference. The stone path was an ancient tradition. It was meant for newly blooded warriors, for those whose wolves had just emerged. A stone path walk was a test of endurance and strength, each stone representing a year of the wolf's power. It was not meant to be cruel. It had never been designed to be used this way. Several people did laugh, not all of them, but enough. Enough that the laughter filled the space the way smoke fills a room, moving into every corner. Mara set the tray down on the nearest table, very carefully, so that nothing fell. She looked at Colt. "All right," she said. He blinked. He had expected more. He had expected tears, or a shaking refusal, or the particular pleasure of watching someone try to hold themselves together in public. He had not expected 2 calm words. She walked to the edge of the stone path, marked with flat river rocks along the ground of the ceremony area. Colt recovered quickly. He gestured for someone to bring a stone, a smooth river rock, the kind pulled from the creek at the valley's edge, and carried it himself to where she stood, placing it in her arms with exaggerated ceremony. The crowd watched. Mara held the stone. It was not heavy. It was just a rock. She had lifted heavier things by 7 in the morning on any given day of her life. What was heavy was standing in front of the pack that had decided she was the punchline, holding their prop, being their entertainment, and choosing, in that moment, not to let it show. She stood with the stone in her arms and looked ahead at the path, and she thought about her grandmother, whom she had never met, but whom Arlen had described to her once, briefly, as a woman who never let anyone see her tired. She thought about her mother, who had died when Mara was 9, with the quiet dignity of someone who had practiced being overlooked so long it had become a kind of armor. She thought about all of that, and she breathed, and she did not cry. Colt eventually made a gesture that was meant to signal the end of the joke, turning away to speak to someone else, already moving on to something more interesting. The crowd drifted. A few people glanced back at her with expressions she could not quite read, something between discomfort and embarrassment, though not on her behalf. She set the stone down at the edge of the path with care, and walked back to the kitchen. Arlen was still at the cutting board when she returned. "The bread got cold," Mara said. Arlen looked at her. She looked at Arlen. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. "There's a fresh loaf in the lower oven," Arlen said. "Take it out in 10 minutes." Mara nodded and went to check the fire. The days that followed moved in the usual rhythm. Tasks before dawn. Tasks through the morning. A brief half-hour in the afternoon, when she sometimes allowed herself to sit near the window of the storage room on the east side of the kitchen building, where the light came in at an angle that was almost kind, and read whatever she had managed to borrow from the archive. The archive was not officially open to Omegas, but the archivist, an elderly man named Grover, had a memory that had become selective with age. He forgot, specifically and repeatedly, that Mara was not permitted to take books. She did not remind him. She had been reading everything she could find about pack law for the past 2 years. Not because she had a plan. She was too honest with herself to pretend she had a plan. But she had a habit of collecting information the way she collected kindnesses, one at a time, quietly, in case it ever mattered. Pack law was dense and dry, and most of it was ancient, written in the language of an era before her grandmother was born. But she read it anyway. Rushy took notes in the margins of her own small notebook, which she kept tucked under a loose board in her sleeping quarters. On the second evening before the ceremony, she sat with the notebook open and added a new entry. "The stone path tradition," she wrote, "predates the current elder system by at least 4 generations. It carries specific legal protections under sovereign law. Specifically, under Section 9 of the Territorial Compact, any abuse of a ceremonial tradition can be reported directly to the sovereign court, without going through local leadership." She stopped writing. She looked at the page for a long time. Then she wrote, "This probably doesn't matter." But she did not cross it out. The night before the awakening ceremony, she could not sleep. She lay in her narrow bunk in the shared sleeping quarters at the back of the kitchen building, staring at the wood planks of the ceiling, listening to the sound of the wind in the trees outside. The other kitchen workers slept around her, their breathing slow and even. She thought about tomorrow. She thought about standing on the ceremony field, off to one side, watching the ranked wolves be inducted while she stood in the part of the crowd reserved for non-participants. She thought about Colt's face during his speech, and the laughter that had filled the hall. And then she thought about something else. She thought about the man in the gray coat, the one she had seen in the East Yard. There had been something in the way he stood that had stayed with her. Not the way dominant wolves stood, all assertion and performance. He had stood still with the quiet of someone who had nothing left to prove. She had seen that stillness only a handful of times in her life. It was not a pack thing, it was a power thing, but not the kind of power that needed witnesses. She told herself it was irrelevant. She told herself to stop thinking about a stranger she had seen for 30 seconds at 7 in the morning. She almost managed it. The ceremony field was bright the next morning, the sun cutting through the autumn haze and falling flat and golden across the stone circle at the field's center. The pack gathered in a large ring around the ceremony space, and the young wolves stood in a line at the field's edge, dressed formally, nervous and proud in equal measure. Mara stood at the back of the gathering crowd, near the tree line, where she could see without being particularly visible. Elder Renner stood at the circle's center, his formal robes catching the light, his voice projected with the practiced ease of someone who had performed ceremonies for decades. He spoke of strength and lineage, and the sacred bond between a wolf and its pack. Mara had heard the speech before. She found herself watching the crowd rather than the ceremony, the way she often did, looking at faces, reading the small signals that most people didn't realize they were sending. She noticed several of the warriors glancing toward the edge of the field, behind the crowd, more than once, with the particular attention of people who were trying not to be caught looking. She turned slowly to see what they were looking at. At the far edge of the ceremony field, standing just inside the tree line, watching the proceedings with calm and unhurried attention, was the man in the gray coat. And this time, because she was looking directly at him, and not pretending not to, she saw his face clearly. She did not recognize him from the pack. She did not recognize him from any gathering she had ever attended, but something about the way the nearest warriors kept their distance from him by exactly the right amount of space, not too close, not too obviously far, told her something significant about who he was. She looked at him for a moment longer than she should have, and then he looked back at her. She turned back to the ceremony immediately. Her heart was doing something she did not find useful. She focused on Elder Renner's voice, and on the young wolves being brought into the circle one at a time. When the ceremony was over, and the pack had moved back toward the main hall for the celebration meal, Mara went to the kitchen to help Arlen with the serving. She did not look back at the tree line. But she thought, for the rest of the day, about a pair of calm, dark eyes that had met hers, without hierarchy, without judgment, and without looking away first. She wrote nothing about it in her notebook that night. Some things were too fragile to put into words. The first stone was already on the shelf in the Hall of Weights. She had walked past it that morning, the smooth river rock from the ceremony, now officially registered with her name carved into the wood below it, the accusation of disrupting the ceremony etched into the stone's surface in rough letters. It had been placed there while she served breakfast. Someone had thought to do it while her hands were full. She had looked at it for a count of 3. Then she had walked on. 1 stone. Her name. A lie dressed in ceremony. She thought of her notebook. She thought of sovereign law. She thought of Section 9. She thought about the man in the gray coat, and the way he had stood still, with nothing to prove. And she thought, not yet, but someday. The second stone arrived 11 days after the first, and it arrived faster than Mara had anticipated. She had been watching for it, not with dread exactly, but with the particular attention of a person who has learned to read weather patterns, the shift in air pressure before the storm, the way certain people's eyes move before they say something that will cost her. She had been watching Colt Renner especially, the way he moved through spaces she occupied, the extra second he lingered when he saw her, the way his eyes measured her as though calculating something. She did not know what she had done to earn the second stone. That was, she had come to understand, largely irrelevant. The stones were not really about what she had done. They were about what was convenient. They were about who in the pack needed a name to put beside an inconvenience, and whose name was the easiest to use without consequence. The second stone was placed on the shelf on a Tuesday, 3 days after the harvest preparation had gone wrong. The harvest preparation was an important event for Silvercrest. Every autumn, before the first true frost, the pack organized a ritual of preservation, salting, drying, storing. It required the kitchen to coordinate with the supply teams, the hunters, and the South Storage Building, in a sequence that had been refined over many generations. A cook, Arlen managed it. She was good at it. She had not failed it in 30 years. This year, a third of the dried grain stores had been found contaminated, damp, beginning to mold, unusable. The discovery sent the kitchen into controlled crisis. Arlen worked through the night, recalculating portions. Mara worked beside her, and beside Grover, who had appeared with a lantern and an apology, and beside 2 of the younger kitchen workers who looked frightened by the scale of the problem. It was not a catastrophic failure. The pack would not go hungry, but it was a significant loss, and losses in a wolf pack were never permitted to simply be accidents. Someone had to carry the weight of it. That was the unwritten rule. 3 days later, while Mara was sorting the salvageable grain in the east storehouse, Colt arrived with 2 of his warriors, and a formal expression that she recognized immediately. It was the expression of someone who had already made a decision, and was here to deliver the aftermath. "We've determined," he said, without preamble, "that the contamination was caused by water damage in the lower storage area. The lower storage area was accessed last by you." Mara set down the scoop in her hand. "I brought supplies to the lower storage," she said, keeping her voice even. "I didn't leave water standing. I checked the floor before I left." "The floor was wet," Colt said. "Witnesses confirm it." She looked at him steadily. "Who are the witnesses?" He blinked, just slightly. "That's not how this process works. Then how does this process work? She said. It was a small challenge, small enough that he could have dismissed it easily, attributed it to confusion or ignorance. But Colt had never liked being questioned, even mildly, even by someone he considered beneath question. His expression shifted, just slightly, toward something harder. The determination has been made, he said. The stone will be registered. She watched him leave. She watched his warriors follow. She stood in the east storehouse with the cold smell of grain around her, and thought, carefully, about the lower storage floor. She had checked it, she was certain of this. She always checked. It was part of the sequence Arlen had taught her, the systematic walkthrough after every delivery, noting condition and temperature and any moisture on the floor. She had done it the same way for 3 years. She had done it that day too. She also thought about something else. She thought about the fact that the lower storage had 2 entry points, the main door and the service hatch on the building's western side. The service hatch was rarely used. It was not on her route. She had no reason to enter from there. But someone did use it. She had seen it open twice in the past month, both times late in the evening, both times with the particular quietness of a door opened by someone who did not want to be heard. She had noted this in her notebook, both times, without knowing why it mattered. Now she thought it might matter. But she had no proof, and with no proof, she had no voice that anyone would hear. The second stone was smooth granite, darker than the first. Her name below it again. The accusation etched in plain letters. Negligent management of pack supplies. She looked at it. She looked at the first one beside it. She counted the space on the shelf for how many more could fit, and she breathed, and she walked away. Arlen knew, without Mara saying anything, that the second stone was unjust. Arlen knew most things without being told. She had been in the pack long enough to understand how these processes worked, who they protected and who they did not. She said nothing about it directly. She said, instead, on the morning after the stone was placed, I want you to start running the supply inventory checks. All of them, every storehouse, every route, and I want you to write down every single thing you find, every date, every signature. Mara looked at her. It's just a new task, Arlen said, turning back to the stove. Nothing more than that. She began the inventory that same day. She was thorough in a way that went beyond what Arlen had specifically asked for. She noted conditions. She noted dates. She noted the western hatch on the lower storage building, the slight disturbance of dust around its seal that suggested recent use. She noted the timestamps on the supply records and cross-referenced them with the duty rosters, and found a gap, a period of 4 hours, on the night before the contamination was discovered, when the lower storage was officially unmonitored. She wrote all of this in her notebook with small, careful letters. She was not angry. That surprised her sometimes, how little anger she felt, compared to what the situation probably warranted. She examined herself for it regularly, the way you check a wound, to see if it is healing. What she found was not anger. It was something quieter and more persistent. A kind of cold clarity, the clarity of a person who has had the luxury of strong emotions removed from them by years of finding that strong emotions only made things worse, and who has replaced them with something more durable. The clarity said, pay attention, record everything. Wait. The third stone came 2 weeks after the second, this one pinned to a report that claimed Mara had been overheard speaking disrespectfully about the Alpha. She had not been near the Alpha that week. She had not spoken to anyone about the Alpha. The report gave no specific time, no specific location, no specific quote, just a claim and a stone, and the familiar carving of her name into the wood below. She went to the shelf in the Hall of Weights, the morning after it was placed, and stood before all 3 of them. 3 smooth stones in a line. 3 lies. She thought about pack law. She thought about the sovereign court. She thought about Section 9 of the Territorial Compact. She also thought about the man in the gray coat, who had been gone from Silvercrest for 11 days now, and whom she had not seen since the ceremony. She did not know why she kept thinking about him. He was probably nothing to do with any of this. He was probably some traveling merchant or a scout from a neighboring territory, passing through for routine reasons. He had looked at her once. People looked at each other all the time. It did not mean anything. She went back to the kitchen and started the morning bread. By the 4th stone she had begun to notice something that disturbed her more than the stones themselves. The other pack members were changing. Not dramatically, not all of them. But there was a shift in the way she was treated that went beyond the usual overlooking. People who had simply ignored her before now moved away when she entered a room. Young wolves who had been neutral, not friendly, but neutral, began to avoid her eyes. The kitchen workers who shared her sleeping quarters were quieter, less likely to include her in the small exchanges of daily life that had previously been as natural as passing salt at the table. The stones were working the way they were designed to work. They were not just punishments, they were signals. They were a message to the rest of the pack that said, "This person is less than you thought. This person has been measured and found unacceptable. Adjust your behavior accordingly." It was efficient, Mara thought. It was almost elegant in its cruelty, if you studied it from the outside. One stone could be dismissed. 4 stones carried a different kind of weight. 4 stones looked like patterns, looked like evidence. Evidence looked like truth. She sat with her notebook late one evening, in the storage room with the last of the autumn light coming through the small window, and she wrote, 4 stones. None of them real, all of them effective. She sat for a moment, then she wrote, "The Hall of Weights was designed to record genuine transgressions. It was a record-keeping tool, not a punishment system. Originally it required 2 witness signatures per stone. At some point, the requirement was reduced to 1. Then 1 witness became 1 senior pack member's word. The erosion was probably gradual. These things always are." She paused. She wrote, "This is how injustice works. Not in one terrible moment, but in small adjustments over time. Each adjustment seems small. Each one is justifiable on its own. But accumulated, they build a structure that is nearly impossible to see from inside it, because you have been adjusting along with it." She closed the notebook. She put it under the loose board. She sat in the quiet for a while. The 5th stone was placed during a period when she was ill, a fever that kept her in her bunk for 3 days, which Arlen managed by bringing her broth and monitoring her temperature with the focused care of someone who expressed concern through logistics. While she was in her bunk, unable to work, a training session for the young warriors had apparently been disrupted by a missing set of equipment. The equipment had last been logged as stored in a building that Mara was responsible for organizing. She had organized it. She knew exactly where the equipment was. She had logged its location in the supply records. The equipment was not found there when the warriors looked for it. It was found elsewhere, in a separate building, 2 days after the training session, which meant the training had been cancelled, and the warriors had been inconvenienced, and someone needed to explain why. Mara's name was already familiar to the Elder Council. By this point it appeared on 4 stones. The 5th required very little deliberation. When she recovered from the fever and returned to work, Arlen said nothing. She handed Mara a cup of tea that was stronger than usual, and put her to work on the dough, and they did not discuss it. But that evening, Mara went to the Hall of Weights for the first time, with a different purpose. She had always looked at the stones. Now she looked at the rest of the hall. She looked at the structure of it, where records were kept, how the registration process worked, who had access, what the chain of custody was for a stone once it was placed. She spent 40 minutes in the hall, moving quietly, reading everything that was publicly posted, noting dates and sequences on the stones that bore other pack members' names. She found something. 2 of her stones, the 3rd and the 5th, had registration dates that were marked in an unusual ink, darker than the surrounding entries, different in density. She knew this because she had spent 3 years cross-referencing archive records and supply logs, and had become, without particularly meaning to, extremely good at spotting inconsistencies in written materials. The registration dates on stones 3 and 5 had been amended after initial entry. She was certain of it. She wrote this in her notebook. She wrote the specific differences in ink and line pressure. She dated the entry. She slept almost not at all. The 6th stone came in the deep of winter, placed the morning after a fire in the herb shed at the edge of the kitchen grounds. The fire had been minor, contained before it spread, more smoke than flame, no real damage. Its cause was obvious to anyone who looked. A drying rack had been placed too close to a warming brazier, and the dry herbs had caught. It was exactly the kind of accident that happened in herb sheds during cold months. Every experienced kitchen worker understood this. The report registered Mara's name as the last person to have been in the shed that afternoon. This was true. She had been there for 20 minutes checking stock. She had also moved the drying rack away from the brazier while she was there. specifically because she had noticed it was too close. She had moved it. Someone had moved it back after she left. She had no proof of this, but she knew what she had done with her own hands in that shed, and she knew the position of the rack when she had left it, and those two things did not align with the position documented in the incident report. 6 stones. Her shelf in the hall of weights was becoming crowded. Arlen, the morning after the 6th stone, did something she had never done before. She sat down at the kitchen table across from Mara, poured 2 cups of tea, and looked at her directly. "They're not going to stop," Arlen said. Mara wrapped her hands around the cup. "I know. There's a limit to how long I can keep you employed in the kitchen. The pressure is going to increase. Eventually the Elder Council will use the stones as justification to reassign you to the outer grounds." "I know," Mara said again. "So, what are you going to do?" Mara thought about her notebook. She thought about the ink inconsistencies on the registration dates. She thought about the service hatch on the lower storage building. She thought about the unsigned letter she had been composing and revising for 4 months, in the very back pages of the notebook, in letters so small they were barely legible. "I'm going to be patient," she said. Marlon looked at her for a long moment. Then she picked up her cup and drank, and didn't say anything else. But Mara saw her nod. Just once, and small, and with the particular gravity of a person who is acknowledging something important, without wanting to make a large thing of it. The 7th stone arrived 3 weeks after the 6th, on a gray morning in early winter, when the ground was frozen and the sky carried the thick, pressed-down feeling of coming snow. This one was different. The previous stones had at least maintained the appearance of connecting her to a specific event, a specific failure. The 7th did not bother. It cited her Wolfless status as evidence of an inherent incapability to maintain pack standards. That was all. No incident, no missing equipment, no wet floor, no disrupted training. Just the fact of what she was, formalized and placed on the shelf, as though it were a transgression in itself. She stood in the hall of weights, and looked at the 7th stone, and something shifted inside her. Not anger. She had said before, that she did not feel anger, and that was still largely true. But this was something adjacent to it, something that had a heat to it, low and steady, like embers rather than flame. The 7th stone was not about her. It was about everyone who was like her, every Omega who carried more than their weight. Every member of a pack who had been decided about before they were ever truly known. Every person whose absence of a specific power had been used to justify the presence of every burden. She walked back to the kitchen. She sat in the storage room, with the last of the pale winter light coming in flat and thin. She opened her notebook to the back pages, and she took out the letter she had been composing for 4 months. She read it through. She made 3 corrections. She folded it once. She was not ready yet to send it, but she was closer. The 8th stone was placed on an ordinary morning while she was serving the breakfast meal, and when she walked past the hall of weights afterward and saw it there, a flat piece of dark shale, her name below it again, the accusation reading disruption of sovereign visitation protocols, she stopped completely for the first time. She stood in the doorway of the hall of weights and looked at 8 stones bearing her name, all in a row on the shelf, and she thought about what Elder Renner had said, loudly, and in front of a hall full of pack members, the previous evening, when the news had spread that a sovereign convoy was traveling toward the territory. He had said, "The Wolfless girl's presence is an embarrassment to the pack. Keep her out of public sight during the visit." She had been told to stay in the kitchen, and she had done exactly that. She had not been in the public areas at all, during the brief period when the sovereign convoy passed through the outer grounds. And yet here was the 8th stone. Disruption of sovereign visitation protocols. She looked at the stone for a very long time. Then she turned around. She went to the storage room. She retrieved her notebook from under the board. She opened it to the back pages, and she took out the letter. She read it once more. It was clear. It was specific. It was factual. It cited dates, stone numbers, ink inconsistencies, supply records, witness gaps, and the original version of the stone path tradition, and what pack law said about its misuse. As she folded it, she sealed it with the wax she had been saving for this purpose. She addressed it in her smallest, steadiest letters to the sovereign court, Attention General Record. She was not naive. She knew there was a reasonable chance that the letter would arrive and be filed, and nothing would happen. She knew that the court dealt with thousands of complaints from PAC members across a wide territory, and that most of them were handled slowly, if at all. But she also knew something she had found in the archive 14 months ago, a small footnote in the territorial compact that Grover had confirmed was still legally active. Complaints filed directly with the sovereign court by Wolfless PAC members carried a mandatory review designation under Section 11. Mandatory review, not optional, not whenever convenient. She tucked the letter inside her coat. The convoy was still in the area. She had heard it would be moving on by evening. The Sovereign Court's records office traveled with all official convoys. She had one afternoon. She put on her coat. She put on her worn boots. She walked out the kitchen door and across the east yard and down toward the outer grounds, where the Sovereign convoy was still parked in a long line of black vehicles along the access road. She walked steadily, without hurrying. The hurrying drew attention, and she kept her eyes forward and her expression ordinary, and she thought about her grandmother, who had stood somewhere in this same territory, in the same cold air, with the same blood in her veins, and had probably also thought about what she was risking versus what she was owed. She reached the records office, and she knocked. The clerk who answered looked at her with the professionally neutral expression of someone trained to receive all manner of visitors without reacting to any of them. She handed him the letter. Mandatory review designation, she said, Section 11 of the Territorial Compact. He looked at the letter. He looked at the return designation she had written on the outside. He looked at her face with the same neutral expression. It will be logged today, he said. She nodded. She walked back to the kitchen. She had 3 days before the convoy left entirely. After that, the letter would travel with the court records to the central office. After that, who knew? She helped Arlen with the evening meal. She was careful and thorough, and she did not drop anything. That night, lying in her bunk, she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not relief, not hope, exactly. Something smaller. Something that did not have a large name. The particular feeling of a person who has done something that cannot be undone, and has decided they are at peace with that. A quiet, clean thing that settled in her chest, like the last piece of a very long-worked puzzle sliding into place. She let herself lie with it until she fell asleep. The 9th stone had not been placed yet. But she thought, in that last quiet moment before sleep took her, that when it came, she would be ready. She did not know then how it would come. She did not know who would carry it. She only knew that this time, she would not be standing alone when it arrived. Winter in Silvercrest had a sound. It was not the wind, though the wind was constant from November through February, cutting down from the ridge in long, cold gusts that rattled the window frames and found every gap in every wall. It was not the snow either, though the snow was heavy and relentless, and arrived each night and had to be cleared each morning. The sound of winter in Silvercrest was the sound of the Hall of Waits in the early mornings, when only Mara and the cold and the 8 stones were in the room together, and there was nothing to hear but the faint settling of the old building under the weight of the snow on its roof. She had started going to the Hall of Waits in the mornings. Not every morning, but several times a week, before the rest of the pack woke, when the light was still gray and thin, and the hall was empty and quiet. She would stand before the shelf that bore her name, and look at the 8 stones, and she would go through each one in her mind, the specific date, the specific accusation, the specific evidence she had gathered against it. She did this the way a person rehearses a speech, not because she was planning to make one, but because she needed to keep the facts alive and precise in her memory, needed to feel the shape of each injustice clearly, so that it did not blur over time into something vague and hard to hold. Facts were slippery when you were the only one keeping track of them. She knew this from experience. She had watched the pack's version of events calcify around each stone over time, the way ice forms around a rock in a river, until the original shape was obscured. Cook Arlen knew, Grover, the archivist probably suspected, but for the rest of the pack, the stones were already history, already settled, already true, in the particular way that things become true when no one contradicts them loudly enough for long enough. She was not ready to contradict them loudly. Not yet. But she was building the case in her mind, with the systematic care of someone who had learned that the right time to speak was worth waiting for. In the meantime, she worked. She worked the way she always had, thoroughly, without complaint, in the specific and unremarkable way of someone who had no energy to waste on performance. The kitchen was her domain, in a way that had never been formally acknowledged, but was practically understood. Arlen ran it, but Arlen also trusted Mara with every part of the operation, in a way that she trusted no one else. The younger workers came to Mara with questions about timings and temperatures, and the particular logic of the supply rotation. Mara answered them, without thinking much about it. It was simply what she knew. The winter was long and cold that year, and the kitchen was a source of heat and purpose in the short gray days. Mara found that she could almost set aside the stones in the quiet rhythm of the work. The bread in the oven, the soup on the fire, the daily inventory that had become her private research project under the guise of being a duty. She cataloged everything. She made connections. She added pages to her notebook that were dense with dates and cross-references, and small careful notations that were beginning, after months of accumulation, to tell a coherent story. The story was not about her, exactly. It was about the Renner family. That this was something she had not expected when she began keeping records. She had assumed the stones were about Colt Renner specifically, his particular dislike of her, his specific need for entertainment. But the deeper she went into the pack's records, and the supply logs, and the archive documents that Grover accidentally left accessible, the more clearly she saw a pattern that was older than Colt. The Renner family had been using the Hall of Weights as a management tool for at least a generation. Other pack members had been on the receiving end of it before her. She found 4 names in the older records that showed similar patterns, accumulating stones across a short period, all tied to either the Renner family's business interests or their territorial disputes with other pack families. 3 of those 4 names were no longer in the pack records at all. They had left Silvercrest. 1 had been formally expelled. The 4th was her grandmother. She sat with this knowledge for a long time after she found it. Elara Voss had been a full wolf. Elara Voss had been a ranked member of the pack, and Elara Voss had spent the last 3 years of her life in Silvercrest, accumulating stones in the Hall of Weights, 12 of them in total, until the Elder Council had used them as formal justification to reclassify her within the pack structure. Reclassify was the word the documents used. What it meant, in practice, was that her status had been reduced. Her wolf, officially recognized as weakened by documented negligence, was no longer counted in the pack's strength assessments. Her territory access had been restricted, and her daughter, Mara's mother, had been born into a family that was already halfway to invisible. Mara sat in the storage room, with Grover's borrowed lantern, and the document open on her knee, and she let herself feel the weight of this, for exactly as long as she could afford to. It was a long time. It was also not long enough, but she could not afford more than she allowed herself, because grief and rage were luxuries that ate the kind of clarity she needed to keep. So she let the feeling pass through, and she picked up her pen, and she wrote, very precisely, a new section in her notebook. She titled it, The Renner Family and the Voss Family, A Documented History. She wrote everything she knew. She cited every document, every date, every witness signature that appeared in the archive records. She wrote 12 pages in a single evening, small and precise, and when she was done, she read it through twice and added 3 more pages of cross-referencing. Then she sat back and looked at what she had built. It was not proof of everything. There were gaps, places where the record had been cleaned, or the documents were missing, or the witnesses were dead or gone. But it was more than anyone had ever assembled before. It was specific and documented, and supported by dates that could be verified independently. She thought about the letter she had sent with the Sovereign Convoy's records clerk. She thought about Section 11 of the Territorial Compact and the mandatory review designation. She added a second letter that night, shorter, more specific, with 3 pages of supporting evidence folded inside. She had no way to send it immediately. The convoy had already moved on, but she kept it ready. January gave way to February, and February to a slow and grudging March. The snow began to ease. The light began to last a little longer each day. Mara worked and recorded and waited, with the particular patience of someone who had spent 21 years developing patience as a survival skill, and had become, as a result, exceptionally good at it. Colt Renner ignored her through most of the winter. This was unusual. His attention had a rhythm she had mapped over years, active in autumn and spring, when pack activity was high, quieter in the deep winter when he was occupied with the hunting parties and the border patrols that were the primary work of a beta in the cold months. She did not trust the quiet. She kept her records current. The thing she had not expected was the conversation with Grover. It happened on a Thursday in late February, in the archive room, where Mara had come ostensibly to return 2 borrowed volumes. Grover was at his desk in the corner, doing the slow and careful work of cataloging a new collection of documents that had apparently come from the estate of a pack elder who had died in the autumn. He looked up when she came in, and nodded, and returned to his work. She set the volumes on the return shelf. She was about to leave when Grover said, without looking up from his cataloging, "There's a document in this collection that might interest you." She turned. "What kind of document?" "The kind that involves your family," he said. He still did not look up. He was turning a page with the careful hands of someone who handled old paper the way other people handled glass. She came to the desk. He did not hand her the document. He left it lying open on the surface in front of him, and moved slightly to the side, to give her room to see it, without technically giving it to her. She read. It was a land transfer document, dated 31 years ago. It showed a transfer of territory rights from the Voss family to the Renner family, signed by Elder Renner's predecessor, witnessed by 2 council members. The transfer was recorded as voluntary. The Voss family had agreed to cede the territory. The territory in question was the south quarter of Silvercrest, the area that had flooded 15 years ago, the area that was now the site of the pack's most productive hunting ground, which the Renner family managed and profited from. She looked at the document. She looked at the date. She thought about her grandmother and 12 stones, and a family reclassified into nothing. Voluntary, she said quietly. That's what it says, Grover said. He turned another page. Do you believe that? Grover was quiet for a moment. I believe, he said carefully, that a family with 12 stones, registered against their name, and a reclassification pending, might experience pressure that makes many outcomes feel voluntary. She looked at him. He was still looking at his cataloging. He was an old man who had spent his life among documents, and who had developed, over those years, a very precise understanding of the difference between what records said and what had actually happened. Can I borrow a pencil and paper? She said. There's some on the shelf behind you, he said. She copied every detail of the land transfer document by hand, in her small, careful letters. She noted the document's catalog number. She noted the condition of the original. She noted Grover's initials on the cataloging sheet beside it. She thanked him when she was done. He nodded without looking up. She left. She was 3 steps out the archive door when she stopped and went back. Grover, she said. He looked up. When the Sovereign convoy was here in the autumn, she said, was there a records inspector with them? He thought about this. There was a woman, he said, short, brown coat. She spent about 2 hours in the East Records building, going through the public files. Mara had not known that. Thank you, she said. She left. She walked back to the kitchen in the late afternoon light, the cold air sharp in her lungs, the copied document folded inside her coat, alongside the second letter, and 3 months of collected evidence. She thought about the records inspector in the brown coat who had spent 2 hours in the East Records building. She thought about what that inspector might have found, and what she might have noted, and where those notes would have gone. She thought about the mandatory review designation on the first letter she had sent. She thought about the Sovereign Court, somewhere far from Silvercrest, in a place she had never been, receiving letters and filing them, and perhaps, on some ordinary day that had nothing special about it from the outside, actually reading them. She had no way to know if any of this was working. She had no feedback, no signal, no visible evidence that anything she had done had been received or considered. She had only the record she kept, and the evidence she built, and the patience she maintained. She also, she realized, as she pushed open the kitchen door and walked back into the warmth of the fire, had something else. She had the truth, specifically and in detail, the truth on paper, in dates and signatures and ink inconsistencies and land records and a family history that stretched back 3 decades. The truth was not nothing. It did not always win, but it was not nothing. Arlen looked up from the evening stew. You were gone longer than usual. I stopped at the archive, Mara said. Find anything useful? Mara took off her coat and hung it on the hook. I found several things, she said. Arlen looked at her. Arlen, who had worked in this kitchen for 30 years and had learned everything worth knowing about a person, from how they stood at the end of a long day, looked at Mara's face and seemed to find something there she had not found before. Good, Arlen said, and she turned back to the stew. Spring came slowly to Silvercrest, advancing in small degrees, the ice releasing its grip on the creek by half a foot at a time. The training yard was muddy and busy, and the pack was loud again, with the energy of the season change. The particular restlessness of wolves, who had been inside too long. Mara worked and observed and stayed quiet. She was waiting, now, in a different way than before. Before, she had been waiting with the vague and formless hope of a person who has run out of other options. Now she was waiting with the focused attention of a person who has built something and is watching for the moment when it becomes relevant. She did not know what that moment would look like. She had no reliable source of information about what happened after a mandatory review designation was filed at the Sovereign Court. She had found only one reference to the process in all her research. A brief notation in a procedural document that said reviews were assigned to a court inspector and conducted on a rotating basis according to priority. She did not know what determined priority. She did not know how long the rotation was. She did not know if her case would be considered significant enough to move quickly, or whether it would sit in a stack for years. She knew only that it was there, that someone, somewhere, had a file with her name and her evidence and a stamp that said mandatory review. She also knew, because she had become very good at watching, that Colt Renner had been meeting with his father more frequently in the past 3 weeks. The meetings were in Elder Renner's private office, the door closed, the conversations quiet enough that they did not carry. This was not usual for them. They were not typically careful men. They were men who had operated without consequence for long enough that they had stopped taking precautions. The fact that they were taking precautions now meant that something had reached them that made precautions feel necessary. She wrote this in her notebook on a Wednesday morning in early spring. The light coming in green and pale through the storage room window, the last of the snow melting off the eaves outside. Something had changed. She did not know what yet, but she could feel it in the small shifts of the pack's behavior, the way you can feel a change in weather before the clouds arrive. She could feel it in the way certain council members had stopped making eye contact with Colt Renner in public. She could feel it in the way Elder Renner had canceled the last 2 regular council meetings without explanation. She kept her notebook current, she kept her evidence organized, she kept her mornings in the kitchen, and her afternoons in the inventory, and her evenings quiet. And she waited, with the cold, clear patience of a person who has learned that the right moment, if you have prepared well enough and paid close enough attention, has a way of eventually arriving. She was not wrong about that. It was a Tuesday in mid-spring when she came out of the east storehouse and found the access road to the outer grounds crowded with vehicles she did not recognize. Black vehicles, well made, with the particular quiet efficiency of a convoy that had traveled a long distance and arrived without announcement. She stopped. She looked. She had seen this convoy once before. In the autumn, briefly, from a distance. She recognized the gray coat before she recognized the face. It was difficult not to, because the figure standing at the front of the convoy, speaking in a low voice with 2 companions, was wearing the same coat, the same cut, the same well-made plainness that she had noticed the first time, and the way he stood, that particular stillness, the complete absence of anything performative in his posture, was not the kind of thing you forgot once you had noticed it. She stood at the edge of the storehouse yard and thought, very clearly and without drama, so this is what the moment looks like. She did not walk toward him. She did not do anything visible or notable. She turned and went back inside the storehouse and finished the inventory she had been doing, and wrote the last 3 entries in the supply log with her usual precise handwriting. Then she went to the kitchen and told Arlen that the Sovereign convoy had arrived. Arlen put down the spoon she was holding. She looked at Mara. She picked the spoon back up. "Then you should look presentable," Arlen said. Mara looked down at herself. "I always look presentable. You have flour on your collar." She brushed off the flour. "The notebook," Arlen said. "In my coat pocket," Mara said. Arlen nodded. She picked up the spoon again and stirred the pot, and did not say anything else. But she was very deliberately not looking at Mara's face. and Mara understood this to be Arlen's version of not wanting to say out loud what she was feeling. Mara understood it completely. She felt it too. 8 stones on a shelf, 3 decades of her family's history, erased by manufactured debt. A grandmother whose territory had been taken, and whose wolf had been decided for her. A mother who had lived small, and died early, and passed that smallness on like a gift she hadn't meant to give. And now, in the spring, on a Tuesday, a convoy in the outer yard, a man in a gray coat, a mandatory review designation on a letter filed in the autumn. She put on her clean coat. She straightened her collar. She walked out of the kitchen, into the spring air, and thought about what came next with the careful, precise attention of someone who had spent 4 years preparing for a moment she was not yet certain had arrived. But it was close. She could feel it. It was very close. The Alpha King did not travel light. This was not about luxury. Darian Voss traveled with a full court complement because the work he did required it. 2 inspectors, 3 senior clerks, a legal advocate, a records archivist, 2 security leads, and a small administrative team that could assemble a functioning court session in a tent, on short notice if necessary. He had done it twice in the past 3 years. Once in a disputed territory in the northern region, once in a coastal pack that had managed to go 6 years without filing a single tax record. He was 34 years old, and had been Alpha King for 9 years, which was long enough that he had stopped being surprised by the things packs did when they believed no one was watching. He had also stopped being surprised by his own reactions to those things. In the early years, he had carried a persistent and almost physical anger about injustice, the kind of anger that made his second, Oren, quietly concerned, and that his chief legal advocate, a precise woman named Helen, had told him flatly, would burn him out before he turned 40. He had learned to manage it, not suppress it. Helen had told him that suppression was counterproductive, but channel it, transform it into the methodical thing it needed to be to actually change anything. The anger was still there. It just wore different clothes now. Silvercrest had been on his travel circuit for different reasons. 3 interpack border disputes that had escalated to formal court complaint, a resource allocation conflict involving 3 families and a shared water source. Standard regional management business, the kind that filled most of his schedule on these circuits, and that he handled with the systematic efficiency his court had developed into a reliable process over 9 years. But Silvercrest had also been on his mind since November. The letter had reached the records office in the autumn, filed under the mandatory review designation of Section 11. His chief archivist, a quiet man named Barnard, had flagged it for him, specifically because of Section 11, and because of the volume of supporting evidence enclosed. The letter itself was 1 page, plain and precise. The supporting evidence was extensive. Dates, stone numbers, supply records, ink inconsistency notations, witness gaps, and a detailed account of the stone path tradition's misuse. It was the kind of document that told you something about the person who had written it before you even read the content. The structure of it, the way the information was organized, the absence of any emotional appeal, and the presence of, instead, purely documented fact, that told you this was someone who had thought carefully about what would be useful and what would not, and had chosen usefulness. He had read it twice on the road in the autumn. He had filed it in the priority stack. In the winter, Barnard had brought him a second letter, this one containing a land transfer document that had apparently been found in a pack archive collection. The land transfer was 31 years old. It involved a territory cession that showed, when cross-referenced with the stone records from the same period, a pattern that was difficult to read as coincidence. He had sat with the second letter for longer than he usually sat with things. Then he had asked his records inspector, a short woman in a brown coat named Charlotte, to go back to her notes from the Silvercrest visit in the autumn and tell him what she had found in the East Records building. Charlotte's notes had been interesting. She had found several record anomalies in the pack's administrative files, minor irregularities that alone meant little, but that, combined with the letters and the land transfer document, suggested something that had been operating inside the pack's structures for a long time. Charlotte was careful with her language. She used words like suggests and consistent with and warrants further examination. She was trained to build a case before stating a conclusion. She had written, at the bottom of her summary, the pattern is consistent with systematic record manipulation, over a period of at least 25 years. The primary beneficiary of the pattern appears to be the Renner family. The primary subject of the recent record activity is a pack member identified as Mara Voss. He had added Silvercrest to the spring circuit the same day. The convoy pulled into the outer grounds of Silvercrest on a Tuesday morning in mid-spring, announced only by the formal notification sent 48 hours in advance through the Sovereign Communication Network, which gave the pack enough time to prepare the guest facilities and be formally ready, but not enough time to do anything more extensive than that. 48 hours was not an accident. Darian had learned early in his tenure that the amount of notice you gave a pack before arrival told you a great deal about what you expected to find there. Elder Renner met them at the outer gate with the kind of formal welcome that had been practiced. He was a large man, with the broad frame of a former warrior and the polished manner of someone who had spent decades managing his public presentation. His welcome speech was smooth and warm and contained exactly the right proportion of deference and dignity. Darian listened and shook his hand and thanked him and watched his eyes the whole time. The elder Renner's eyes were not performing the same thing as his mouth. Colt Renner stood slightly behind his father, wearing formal attire that was slightly too careful for a Tuesday morning, suggesting he had dressed for this rather than simply arrived in it. Colt was younger than Darian had expected from the file, mid-20s, physically confident, with the particular bearing of someone who was accustomed to being the most powerful person in any given room, and who had not yet been in enough rooms to know how rare that was. Darian noted him. He did not let the notation show. The convoy was settled into the guest facilities with efficient courtesy. The formal meeting schedule was established for the following morning. The evening would be for the convoy to settle, and for the initial informal walkthrough of the facilities, which was standard practice. The walkthrough was Darian's favorite part of a visit. It was during walkthroughs that he saw things he would not see in formal meetings. The condition of the common areas. The way pack members moved when they were not performing for a visiting king. The small signals of hierarchy that embedded themselves in everyday behavior. Who stepped aside for whom? Who looked at the ground when? Which spaces the lower-ranking members occupied and which they avoided. He had Oren beside him, and Helen slightly behind, both of them doing the same kind of watching in their respective specialties. Oren watched the security arrangements, the physical layout, the markers of a pack's defensive culture. Helen watched the administrative structures, the record-keeping habits, the small procedural tells that indicated how a pack actually governed itself versus how it reported governing itself. They walked through the main hall, through the training yard, through the supply buildings at the pack's center. They were shown the ceremony field, the communal meeting space, the kitchens at the east side of the grounds. It was when they came to the Hall of Weights that Darian paused. He knew what a Hall of Weights looked like. He had walked through dozens of them in his 9 years. They were a standard feature of most wolf packs. The record-keeping function was practical, whatever its original ceremonial purpose. He walked the length of the hall as he always did, reading the names on the shelves, getting a picture of the pack's recent disciplinary activity. He was at the far end of the hall when he came to a shelf that stopped him. 8 stones. The one name. Mara Voss. He stood before the shelf for a moment that was longer than the rest of the walkthrough had been. Oren, who had known him for 9 years and could read his silences with the accuracy of long practice, came to stand beside him without speaking. Darian read each accusation. He read them in order. He read them in the context of everything he already knew from the letters. He did not speak for a moment. Then he said, quietly enough that only Oren could hear, "Find out where she is." Oren moved away without a word. Elder Renner, standing at the hall's entrance with the composed expression of a man who had rehearsed this moment, said, "The Voss matter is something we can certainly discuss at the formal session tomorrow, if your kingship would like to address it." Darian turned to look at him. "We'll address it this afternoon," he said. Elder Renner's expression did not change, but something shifted behind it. "Of course," he said. Darian looked at the shelf one more time. 8 stones with one name. The letters stacked in his memory, factual and precise, organized with the careful intelligence of someone who had been building a case for months. He thought about the letter writer, whoever she was, making those notes in whatever space she had, probably by bad light, probably with no certainty that anything would come of it. He thought about that specific kind of persistence and what it cost. He also thought about the land transfer document. 31 years old. A territory session that his legal team had already confirmed bore the hallmarks of a coerced transaction. A family's history reduced to a paperwork exercise by the people who had profited from the reduction. He said to Helen, who had come to stand at the other side of him, "I'll need the full record package from Barnard this afternoon, before the session." "Already pulled," Helen said. "It's on the table in your quarters." He looked at her. "I pulled it when I saw the name on the shelf," she said. "I recognized it from the letters." He looked at the stones one more time. Then he turned and walked back through the hall toward the guest facilities and his afternoon preparation, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who did not need to perform urgency to feel it. His second meeting of the afternoon, the one he had added to the schedule without telling Elder Renner until midday, was with the PAC's full council. He had requested it as a routine administrative review. He had also, through Helen, quietly arranged for the formal session to include a review of the Hall of Waits records. Elder Renner had accepted this addition to the schedule, with the smooth courtesy of a man who had been managing situations like this for decades. But his eyes had done the thing again, that slight divergence between performance and reality. Darian was used to people who performed well. He was less used to people who had had so long to practice their performance that they had begun to believe it was the same thing as truth. He spent his lunch hour reading the full record package that Barnard had assembled over the winter. It was dense with detail. He read it the way he read all legal material, systematically, noting inconsistencies, building the map of what had actually happened against what was officially recorded. By the time he finished, the picture was clear enough that the gaps in it were themselves informative. Some things had been cleaned from the record carefully enough that the cleaning was visible. He also read, again, the original letter. The one page, the precision of it. He thought about who wrote this way. Not with the practiced language of a legal professional. There was no formal training evident in the phrasing, but with the discipline of someone who had understood instinctively what was and was not useful, who had known that emotion would not serve her and that evidence would. That was not a natural skill. That was something that had been developed, and the development of it told a story of its own, about what this person's life had required of her. He put the letter down. Orrin knocked and entered. "She's working in the East Storehouse," he said. "I've confirmed the identity. She knows we're here. She saw the convoy when she came out of the storehouse this morning. She looked, then she went back inside and finished her inventory." Darian almost smiled. She finished her inventory. Yes. He thought about that. About a person who had waited months for something, who had seen the thing arrive, and who had finished the inventory, before going to tell anyone. "Keep her out of any contact with Colt Renner or Elder Renner until this afternoon's session," he said. "Done," Orrin said. "And send Cook Arlen my thanks for the morning meal. It was excellent." Orrin nodded and left. Darian stood at the window of his temporary quarters and looked at the spring day outside, at the green that was just beginning to soften the hard edges of the PAC's grounds, at the blue sky above the ridges to the east. It was a beautiful place. Silvercrest was genuinely beautiful. It was also a place where a specific family had been running a structured campaign against a weaker one for 3 decades, and where a 21-year-old girl had filed a court complaint with more intellectual rigor and more supporting documentation than half the formal complaints his court received from PAC counsels with access to legal representation. He thought about what the Hall of Waits had looked like, the 8 stones on the shelf, the careful carving of her name in the wood below them, as though putting it there often enough would make it permanent. He thought about what the 9th stone had said, disruption of sovereign visitation protocols. Placed while she had been kept away from the public areas, specifically to avoid her being seen. Placed because Elder Renner had understood that the king's arrival might be connected to the letters, and had wanted to add one more weight to the pile before whatever was coming arrived. The 9th stone was still on the shelf. It had been placed that morning, according to the record timestamp that Helen had quietly checked during the walkthrough. This morning, the day the convoy arrived. He turned from the window. He was not angry, in the way he had been angry in the early years. The thing in his chest was colder and more precise than anger. It was the feeling he had developed over 9 years of watching people use power to press down on those who had none. The feeling that was not rage, but was more lasting than rage, that did not dissipate, but instead accumulated in the specific direction of action. He picked up his formal coat. He put it on. He straightened the collar, the way Helen had taught him, cleanly, without fussing. The session was in 2 hours. He had a great deal to do before then. The hall of weights had never been so full. Mara stood at the back of the gathering, with Arlen beside her, which was unusual. Arlen did not normally attend anything outside the kitchen, except on formal feast days. Arlen had simply appeared at the kitchen door, as Mara was putting on her coat, and said, without explanation, that she was coming too. Mara had not questioned it. The hall was filled with nearly the whole pack. Word had traveled quickly, as word always did in Silvercrest, that the sovereign session this afternoon was not the routine administrative meeting that had been scheduled, but something different. The specific nature of something different had taken only a few hours to circulate, carried in pieces and fragments by the pack's ordinary communication networks. A comment here, an overheard exchange there. The particular nervous energy of the council members who had been in the pre-session meeting that afternoon, and who came out of it with the expressions of people who had received information they were still processing. What Mara knew, specifically, was almost nothing. She knew the convoy had arrived. She knew the session had been moved forward and expanded. She knew that Helen, the king's legal advocate, had sent a formal notice to the kitchen that Mara Voss was requested to attend the afternoon session. A formal notice. Sent to the kitchen. For her, she had read it twice. She had folded it and put it in her coat pocket with the notebook. She had taken off her apron and washed her hands and gone to get Arlen, because Arlen had spent 30 years in this pack and deserved to be present for whatever was coming. Elder Renner was at the front of the hall beside the council table, standing with the composed stillness of someone who had been composed in difficult moments before and intended to remain so. Colt was beside him, slightly less composed. His jaw was set. She recognized the set of his jaw. It was the expression he wore when things were not going as planned, and he was refusing to let that show. The hall of weights was arranged with its shelves along the walls, and a central table that was normally used for record reviews. Today the table had been set with formal documents, a chair behind it for the legal review officer, and 3 chairs at the side for what appeared to be the court's own records team. Helen stood behind the table, with the quiet attention of someone who had been in many halls like this, and found each one interesting in a specific and different way. The king was not in the room yet. Mara found a position near the wall at the back. Arlen stood beside her. Around them, the pack arranged itself in the way packs always arrange themselves, rank and relationship visible in who stood near whom, who left space around whom, who moved away when someone more powerful came to stand nearby. No one moved away from Mara, but they did not make room for her either. She fit herself into the space she had, as she always did. Then the room went quiet in a particular way, a ripple of quiet that moved from the door inward, and the king walked in. She had not been this close to him before. In the autumn she had seen him from a distance twice, and both times she had been careful not to look for too long. Now he was crossing the hall with 2 of his court staff, and the room rearranged itself around his presence in the specific way that rooms rearrange themselves around someone who is accustomed to walking into them, not with performance or dramatics, simply with the physical reality of a very significant person moving through a space, and the space acknowledging it. He walked to the front of the hall and turned, and for a moment the room simply waited. She had a clear sight line to the front. She was looking at his face, and she understood, with the particular acuity of someone who had spent years reading people from a careful distance, that what she was seeing was a man who was very alert and very settled at the same time. Those 2 things should have been contradictory. They were not. She had seen it in him from the first moment in the East Yard, and it was clearer now, in formal context, the kind of stillness that does not come from having nothing at stake, but from having decided exactly what you are doing here. He began to speak. His voice carried without effort, the way voices do that have spent years projecting across large spaces. He did not use formal proclamation language. There were no ceremonial introductions, no long preambles. He simply stated, directly and clearly, that this session was a formal review of the Hall of Weights records and associated pack administrative files, conducted under the authority of the Sovereign Court, and that its findings would be registered at the court level. Elder Renner made a small movement that might have been the beginning of an interjection. Helen looked at him. The movement stopped. The king said, "We'll begin with the records review, Helen." Helen opened the folder on the table and began to speak with the brisk efficiency of someone who has organized a great deal of complex information into a clear sequence and intends to get through it. She read the stone registrations in order: dates, accusation records, witness signatures, and in each case, a brief statement of what the court's review had found regarding the documentation. Stone 1, registered following the awakening ceremony, cited disruption. Court review found no formal disruption was recorded in the ceremony logs. The event was not registered as a disruption by the officiating elder. The stone was registered by Colt Renner without secondary verification. Stone 2, registered following harvest contamination, cited negligent management of pack supplies. Court review found supply log from the relevant date shows no record of moisture on the lower storage floor during Mara Voss's access period. A gap in monitoring coverage between the hours of 4 and 8 in the evening is noted. The contamination timeline is inconsistent with the cited cause. Mara listened to Helen read through 6 stones with the precise, uninflected delivery of a person presenting evidence rather than argument. She kept her breathing even. She kept her hands still at her sides. Beside her, Arlen had gone very quiet. At stone 3 and stone 5, Helen noted the ink anomalies, the registration dates that showed evidence of amendment after initial entry. She cited the court's own document analysis, conducted in the winter by Barnard, who had compared the stones in person during a review visit in January. Mara had not known about the January visit. She had not known Barnard had come. She had been in the kitchen, and the storehouse, and the archive room, and had not noticed an additional court clerk because she had not known to look for one. She thought about this for a moment. The court had been here in January, reviewing documents, cross-referencing records, building the case in their own files. It had been happening at the same time she had been doing the same thing in her notebook. She thought about the letter in the autumn, and the clerk who had received it with a professionally neutral expression, and told her it would be logged today. Stone 6, Stone 7, Stone 8. By the time Helen reached Stone 8, the hall was very quiet. The particular quality of the silence was different from what Mara was used to hearing in pack silences. The usual silence of a crowd watching something uncomfortable, but not wanting to be seen reacting. This was the silence of a crowd absorbing something that was reconfiguring their understanding of events they had believed were already settled. Several people were not looking at Mara. They were looking at Colt Renner. Colt's jaw was still set, but there was something different in his posture now. His shoulders, which had been precisely held since the session began, had changed by a degree that was not visible unless you had been watching him very specifically for a very long time. Mara had been watching him for 4 years. Helen said, "The court's review of stones 1 through 8 finds a pattern consistent with systematic registration, without adequate evidentiary support. 5 of the 8 registrations contain procedural violations of the Hall of Waits Charter, which requires independent verification for all formal stone placements. 2 registrations contain documentation that has been amended after initial entry, which constitutes a record violation under sovereign court standards." The hall remained very quiet. Then Elder Renner said, in the voice he used when he had decided to take control of a situation, "The court's concerns are noted. I would like to address the procedural points directly. Several of these registrations reflect pack-level determinations that are within the Elder Council's authority under territorial." "They are," the king said. A pause. "Pack-level determinations are within the Elder Council's authority," Darian said. "The territorial compact is clear on this. We are not here to challenge that authority." He paused, and the pause was not empty. "We are here because 4 of these stones were registered by a single individual without council approval. 2 have been documented as amended, and 1 was registered this morning, on the day of our arrival, without following any procedure at all. That last one is not a pack-level determination. That is a private individual, using the Hall of Waits for purposes it was not designed for." The Felder Renner was quiet. Colt was very still. The king looked at the shelf. He looked at the 8 stones in a row. Then he said, very calmly, "Bring the 9th stone." There was a moment of confused silence. Someone from the court staff came forward with a flat stone, not from the shelf but from a leather bag that Helen had at the table. A blank one, unused. The king took it. He walked to the record table and picked up the marking chalk from beside the registration book. He wrote something on the stone. He walked to the shelf and picked up the 8th stone, the one registered that morning. and held it in one hand. "This one," he said, "is formally nullified." He set it aside, off the shelf, onto the table. Not thrown, placed, but deliberately. Then he held up the blank stone. He had written one word on it, in clean, clear letters: false. He walked to the far end of the shelf, to the section where stones belonging to the Renner family were registered. There were 3. He set the stone marked false on the shelf below Colt Renner's name. The hall absorbed this. Then he turned. He looked across the crowd to the back of the room, and his gaze moved with the particular attention of someone who knows where to look, and has been looking for the right moment. He found her. She was standing against the wall with Arlen beside her. She had not moved. She had been very still through the entire session. She thought she had been quiet enough that she was not especially visible. She was wrong about that. The king held her gaze for a moment, and then said, across the crowded hall, in a voice that was not especially loud but that carried with the clarity of something said in full seriousness, "I will carry the 9th myself." Several people near the front of the hall caught their breath. Mara heard it, the actual physical sound of people inhaling sharply. She heard someone near the council table say something low and urgent. She heard Elder Renner say something in a tone she had never heard from him before. She did not look at Elder Renner. She looked at the king. The ancient words, she knew what they meant. She had found them in the archive, in a document that was older than the current elder system, older than most of the pack's institutional memory. The phrase carried a specific legal and ceremonial weight that had not been invoked in a very long time. It was the declaration of a sovereign's direct assumption of responsibility, the statement that an injustice had grown heavy enough that the crown itself would bear the weight of its correction. It meant that whatever happened next was no longer a matter for pack-level authority. It meant that she was no longer navigating this alone. She had prepared herself to stand before this hall and present her evidence herself, if that was what was required. She had prepared for challenge, for the long legal process, for the documented resistance that powerful people offered when their version of events was questioned. She had prepared herself, in the most practical and unsentimental way she could manage, for most of the possible outcomes. She had not prepared for this. Arlen, without saying anything, put one hand on her arm, just for a second, then she took it away. Mara did not look at Arlen. She kept her eyes forward. She kept her face still with the discipline of 21 years of practice. But her hands, hidden inside the pockets of her coat, pressed flat against the notebook and the letters and the 4 years of small and careful work, and she breathed, once, all the way in and all the way out. The king had turned back to the hall and was speaking again, outlining the next steps, a full records review, an inspector's investigation, a formal session the following morning for all parties. His voice was calm and methodical. Helen was already writing. Colt had not moved. His father had not moved. Neither of them would have the kind of composure in the next few days that they had been performing today. Mara knew this, not because she was certain of what was coming, but because she understood, finally, after 4 years of watching it operate unchallenged, exactly how it looked when a structure that has protected itself successfully for a very long time began to have trouble. It looked, from the outside, like stillness, like composure, like nothing had changed. But the eyes. She looked at Colt's eyes across the room, and they were doing the thing she had only seen once before, the small, involuntary movement of a person, recalculating in real time, running the new information against the structures they had relied on, finding places where those structures no longer held. He had not expected this. None of them had expected this, she thought. They had expected the sovereign visit to be what it was usually, a formal procedure, deferential to local leadership, transactional and brief. They had expected a king who would do what kings usually did, which was to maintain order, without disrupting the hierarchies that maintained themselves. They had not expected a king who read letters from Wolfless girls at the bottom of a courier stack and added territories to his circuit on a Tuesday. They had not read the same history she had. She looked at the shelf, 7 stones with her name, 1 nullified, 1 marked false on a different shelf entirely. She looked at the king, who had finished speaking, and was consulting quietly with Helen over the documents on the table. She thought about her notebook. She thought about the land transfer document, and the 30 years of history, and her grandmother's wolf, and her mother's quiet life. She thought about all of it, in the compressed and efficient way she had learned to carry large things in a small space. Then she looked at Arlen, who was looking straight ahead, with the expression of someone who has been waiting for something for a very long time, and is not yet allowing themselves to believe it has arrived. "You can breathe," Mara said quietly. Arlen breathed. "So can you," she said. Mara breathed. It was, she thought, a good moment to breathe in. The spring air through the hall's open door, the smell of the grounds outside, green and sharp. The sounds of the pack rearranging itself around the new information, the voices low and startled and questioning. The sound of a structure under pressure, not collapsing yet, but shifted. She thought, not yet, but close. And for the first time in a very long time, close felt like enough. The formal session the following morning was nothing like the session the day before. The session in the Hall of Weights had been dense with its own tension, the particular charge of a room holding its breath around something it had not anticipated. The morning session in the pack's main gathering hall had a different quality. It was organized, it had a structure. And structure, Mara had learned, did not reduce tension so much as give it a shape to fill. She arrived early. She was always early. She had slept almost not at all, which was also not unusual for her in moments of high consequence, and she had spent the hours she was awake going through her notebook one more time, reading each entry in sequence from the first to the most recent, making sure the map in her head was complete and current. When the light came through the small window of the sleeping quarters, and the other kitchen workers began to stir, she put the notebook in her coat pocket and went to the kitchen and helped Arlen start the morning bread, because the bread needed to be started, regardless of what day it was. Arlen had not asked her how she was. Arlen never did. Instead, she had handed her the flour and said, "The fire needs more wood." And Mara had put wood on the fire, and they had worked in the useful quiet that had always been the primary language between them. By the time the session was called, the main hall was full again. Fuller than the day before, if anything. People who had heard the account of the Hall of Weights session from friends and family members who had been there, and in a pack of this size, that was almost everyone, had come to see whatever came next. The session's setup was formal. The court's table occupied the raised end of the hall, where the pack usually held its council meetings. Helen sat at the center with her documents. Barnard, the court archivist, was to her left. Two legal observers that Mara did not recognize were at the far end. Oren stood at the back of the platform, with the specific stillness of someone whose job was to be visible in a particular way. The king was not at the table. He was standing to the side, which was unexpected. Most of the pack had been watching the platform when the session began, and the absence of the king in the expected position had created a brief, confused scanning of the room before people located him, standing at the side wall, near the record shelves, with the same plain attention he had worn in the East Yard and in the Hall of Weights. Elder Renner and Colt were at the respondent's position, two chairs facing the court table, placed on the hall floor rather than the platform. Mara knew enough about court proceedings to understand the significance of that placement. You sat across from the platform, not on it, when you were being reviewed. Elder Renner's posture was still composed. It was, she thought, genuinely impressive. 3 decades of managing situations had given him a resilience that held even now. He sat with his hands on his knees, and his expression appropriately grave, but not defensive, and he looked, from a distance, like a man participating in a serious process with appropriate seriousness. Colt's posture was less successful. He was not composing as well this morning. The set of his jaw was slightly too rigid. His eyes moved more than they should. Mara sat in the section of the hall designated for general attendance. She was not at the front. She had not been given a formal respondent's position or a witness chair, both of which confused her briefly, until Helen had come to the kitchen that morning and explained that the session would proceed with the court's existing documentation first, and that Mara would be called to verify the records if necessary. "If necessary," Mara had said. "The evidence you provided is substantial," Helen said, with the precise neutrality of her professional manner. "We may not need you to do more than confirm dates, but I wanted you to be present." She was present. She sat between Arlen and Grover, who had apparently also decided that the archive could manage without him for a morning. Helen opened the session with a procedural statement, outlining the court's jurisdiction and the scope of the review. She spoke efficiently and without drama. Then she began with the first formal element of the investigation, the stone registration process, and the procedural violations found in 5 of the 8 records. She addressed Elder Renner directly. She explained, clearly and without accusation in her tone, exactly what the charter required for a valid stone registration, and exactly where each of the 5 violated registrations diverged from that requirement. She asked Elder Renner if he wished to respond to each point. Elder Renner responded. He had clearly prepared. He explained, in measured terms, that the pack had operated under an informal understanding of the charter requirements that had evolved over time, that the practices used for Mara's stones were consistent with existing pack customs, and that while he understood the court's concerns about formal procedure, the substantive judgments underlying the stones remained valid. It was a reasonable defense. As defenses went, Mara had anticipated something like it, and had written 3 pages in her notebook in the winter about why it would not hold under the specific scrutiny of the court's requirements. She watched Helen's response with the focused attention of a student, watching a teacher demonstrate the thing she has been working toward. Helen said, with the same even tone, "The court's concern is not with pack-level discretion in determining transgressions. The court's concern is with the fact that 5 registrations cite evidence that, upon review, does not support the listed transgression. Specifically, the supply records from the second stones period do not show moisture access consistent with the cited cause. The monitoring gap in the relevant hours has been documented. The ceremony logs for the first stone do not contain any record of the incident it cites. The security review for the 5th stone finds no evidence placing Mara Voss at the equipment location during the relevant time frame." Elder Renner was quiet for a moment. "Our local records may not reflect the full picture." "That is possible," Helen said, "which is why the court also reviewed the records you maintain independently of the public files. Those records also do not support the cited evidence for stones 2 and 5. A shift in the room, subtle, but audible in the way the silence changed quality. Elder Renner said something to the legal advocate sitting beside him, quietly. The advocate leaned in. Something was exchanged. Then the advocate stood and said that the respondent was exercising his right to pause for consultation. Helen said, "Of course." The room waited. Mara kept her eyes on the platform. Grover, to her right, was very still. Arlen was breathing with the careful deliberateness of someone managing a strong response. The consultation lasted perhaps 4 minutes. Then the advocate sat down, and Elder Renner resumed his position. "The Elder Council," he said, "accepts the court's finding regarding the procedural violations. We are prepared to review the registration processes going forward, and to bring them into alignment with the charter requirements." It was a concession. It was limited, carefully worded, and did not address the substance of the individual stones. But it was the first concession Elder Renner had made in any official proceeding in a long time, and the hall received it with the particular quiet of people who were watching something move that they had not expected to move. Helen made a note. "Thank you," she said. She moved to the next item. The next item was the amended registration dates on stones 3 and 5. This was where Colt Renner's composure began to actually fail. Helen presented Barnard's document analysis, the specific findings about ink density and line pressure in the date fields, the comparison with surrounding entries, the conclusion that both registration dates had been modified after initial entry. She was precise and specific. She cited the exact differences in measurement. She named the methodology Barnard had used. Helen then said, directly, that the court needed to understand who had access to the stones at the time of the amendment, and what the purpose of the amendment had been. Elder Renner began to respond. He had not finished his first sentence when Colt said, unexpectedly, "I amended them." The room went sharply silent. Helen looked at Colt. "Would you like to clarify that for the record?" Colt's jaw was working. The rigidity she had seen in it that morning had resolved into something different, the expression of a person who has been holding a thing for too long, and has made a decision to stop holding it. She recognized the decision, because she had studied the face of a person managing suppression carefully for 4 years, and she knew what it looked like when the suppression broke. "I changed the dates," Colt said. "The original dates were before the incidents happened. I changed them to match the incident dates." Elder Renner said nothing. He looked at his son with an expression that Mara thought was the most genuinely unperformed thing she had ever seen on his face. Helen said, in the same even tone she had used throughout. You changed the registration dates on 2 stones to post-date the incidents they were supposed to have preceded. Yes. That means the stones were registered before the incidents occurred. Colt said nothing. Which means the incidents were not the cause of the registrations, Helen said. The registrations had already been made. The silence was very complete now. Mara sat in it and thought about 3 things simultaneously: the feel of her notebook in her coat pocket, the 8 stones on the shelf in the other room, and her grandmother's land transfer document. She thought about 4 years of kitchen mornings and inventory records and borrowed lanterns and small letters in small notebooks. She thought about the man who had written 1 word on a stone and placed it on a different shelf entirely. Then Helen said to Colt, "Do you understand what you've just stated for the court record?" Colt looked at the platform. He looked at his father. His father was looking at the floor. "Yes," Colt said. Helen made a note. There was a moment of activity from the court side, notes being exchanged. A low conference between Helen and Barnard. Orrin, at the back of the platform, had straightened fractionally. It was a small movement. Mara noticed it. Then the king spoke for the first time since the session had begun. He said, from his position at the side wall, without moving toward the platform, "We'll take a short recess. 15 minutes. It was the most ordinary sentence he had said since arriving in Silvercrest, but the room responded to it the way rooms respond to the specific words of a person whose authority is settled and total. Immediately and without discussion, people began to move and speak in low voices. The court staff turned inward to their own preparations. Elder Renner sat in his chair and did not move. Mara stood. Arlen put a hand on her arm again, the same brief touch as the day before. "Kitchen?" Arlen said. "Not yet," Mara said. She crossed the hall in the direction of the side wall, where the court staff had clustered and where Helen was speaking in a low, rapid voice with Barnard, over a shared document. She was not going to speak to the king. She had not planned to do so. But she needed to move, and the movement carried her in that direction, and she stopped at the edge of the court's cluster and waited. The king looked up. She was closer to him now than she had been at any point except the day before in the Hall of Weights. She could see the specifics of his face clearly, the watchful quality of his attention, the slight lines at the corners of his eyes, that suggested someone who spent a great deal of time focused on things at close range. He was younger than she had expected the Alpha King to be, although she had not had a specific expectation. He was also, she registered somewhere separate from the part of her mind that was managing the rest of the morning, extremely still, in a way that she found oddly steadying. She did not know what she had come here to say. She had not planned to say anything. What she said, quietly enough that only he could hear in the noise of the recess, was, "The land transfer. My grandmother's territory." He looked at her. He held her gaze, with the same directness he had used in the Hall of Weights, the kind of eye contact that did not perform depth, but simply contained it. "That's in the investigation," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted you to know that I have the original comparison document, the archive copy, and the transfer document. I can show the difference in the witness signatures." A pause. "You found that yourself." In the winter, Grover left the catalog open. He looked at her for a moment that was slightly longer than it had to be. Then he said, "Give it to Helen after the session." She nodded. She turned to go. "Mara," he said. She turned back. "You wrote the letters yourself," he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes." "Did anyone help you with the legal references?" "Grover's archive," she said. "And a lot of time." He looked at her. It was not the measuring look she was used to from powerful people, the look that assessed your usefulness or your threat level. It was different. It was the look, she thought, of someone adjusting a previous understanding to accommodate new information, doing it in real time. "The session will resume in 10 minutes, he said. She nodded and walked back to where Arlen was waiting. Arlen said nothing. She looked at Mara's face, and then she looked away. They stood together in the crowded hall, while the recess moved around them, and Mara thought about the land transfer, and her grandmother, and 12 stones, and 30 years of territory taken in papers, and what it cost to hold a place in the world that other people had decided you did not deserve. The session resumed. It would run for 3 more hours, through the afternoon, and by the end of it, 3 things had been formally entered into the court record: Colt Renner's admission, the procedural violations in 5 of the 8 registrations, and the commencement of a full investigation into the PAC's record history, going back 30 years. The elder Renner's formal response would come tomorrow. Colt Renner said very little for the rest of the session. And Mara sat in the general attendance section of the hall with her notebook and Grover and Arlen, and she listened to every word with the focused attention she had developed over 4 years. And she made notes in the margins of the pages that were already full of everything she had collected, and she did not let herself feel what the day deserved to feel like until much later, in the quiet of the kitchen, when Arlen sent everyone else away and made 2 cups of tea and put one on the table in front of her without a word. She wrapped her hands around the cup. She thought about 8 stones and 1 word written in chalk on a blank one. She thought about the session and Colt's admission and the quiet way the court had moved through the evidence she had spent so long collecting. And she thought, for the first time in 4 years, with something resembling certainty, it is going to matter. What she had done in the archive room, what she had written in the notebook, what she had sent in the letters, it was going to matter. The tea was warm. The kitchen was quiet. Arlen drank her cup and looked at the window and said nothing. Mara drank her tea. She let herself feel the day, just a little. It was enough. The court investigators arrived on Thursday morning with 3 cases of documents, and the specific efficiency of people who had done this many times before. Their names were Carol and Pete, which Mara thought were extremely ordinary names for people who were about to go through 30 years of Silvercrest's archived records with the methodical precision of individuals trained to find what other people had worked hard to make unfindable. Carol was perhaps 50, with short silver hair and a way of moving through rooms as though she were measuring them. Pete was younger, thin and quiet, with the unhurried focus of a person who genuinely enjoyed detailed work. They set up in the East Records building, which was cleared for them by order of the court session. Grover assisted them. Grover had not been this visibly energized in the years Mara had known him. He moved through the archive with a purpose that suggested he had been waiting for exactly this kind of access to be granted for a very long time. Mara was not part of the investigation team. She was not in the records building. The investigation was being conducted by the court's own investigators, and her role was to remain available for verification if questions arose about the evidence she had submitted. She worked in the kitchen. She carried out the inventory. She maintained her routines with the careful persistence of someone who knows that a thing does not stop being necessary, simply because something important is happening nearby. Bread needed to be made. The fire needed to be managed. The supply logs needed to be current. But she was very aware of the East Records building from wherever she was on the grounds. Not in a way she could have explained precisely. It was the awareness of someone who has staked something they value in a specific place and can't entirely stop orienting themselves toward it. Orrin came to the kitchen on Thursday afternoon. She recognized him, the king's second, the one who had stood at the back of the platform with the particular stillness of his role. He was tall, with a broad, weathered face, and the expression of someone whose default mode was observation rather than expression. He asked for Cook Arlen. Arlen appeared. They spoke briefly in the doorway, and then Orrin looked past Arlen to where Mara was working at the far end of the kitchen. "You too," Arlen said to Mara. She dried her hands and came to the door. Orrin said, "Helen wants to see you this evening. After supper, the guest quarters." "I'll be there," Mara said. Orrin nodded. He looked at her for a moment, with the assessing attention of someone filing an observation. Then he left. Arlen looked at the door he had gone through, and then looked at Mara. "I'll manage supper," she said. "I always help with supper," Mara said. "And tonight you don't," Arlen said. She spent the remaining afternoon hours in the storage room, with the window and the last of the spring light, going through her notebook one more time. She had been through it dozens of times in the past months. She knew every page, but she went through it again, because she wanted the information to be fully present in her mind when she sat across from Helen, who was a professional, trained to extract exactly what was needed from whatever a witness provided. Helen's quarters were in the guest wing that the convoy used when visiting PACs. Mara had never been in that part of the building. It was not a space she had access to under normal circumstances. She walked through it now, with the alert attention of someone in an unfamiliar environment, noting the way the spaces were arranged, the quality of the materials in the walls and floors, the small differences that indicated the kind of care a PAC extended to visitors of significance. Helen was at a table covered in documents when Mara entered. She gestured to the chair opposite without looking up from what she was reading, and Mara sat in it and waited. Helen read for another minute or two, made a notation, and then put the document down and looked up with her professionally neutral expression. "I appreciate you coming," she said. "Of course," Mara said. Helen opened a fresh sheet of paper. "I want to go through the land transfer document with you, the one you gave me after the session." "All right." "You said you found it in the archive. Walk me through that specifically. When, what you were doing, what Grover's involvement was." Mara walked her through it. The date, the catalog, the specific document, the details she had noticed about the witness signatures. She was precise. She did not editorialize. She gave facts in sequence with the specific dates and locations attached to each one. Helen wrote. Occasionally, she asked a clarifying question. A date, a specific phrasing. How Mara had identified the signature irregularity. The questions were sharp and specific, and revealed a thorough familiarity with the document and with the wider investigation that Mara had not expected. Helen knew details that were not in the evidence Mara had submitted, things that Carol and Pete had apparently found in the archive in the past 2 days. "What did you make of the signature irregularity?" Helen asked, "when you first found it." Mara thought about the right way to say this. "I wasn't certain," she said. "I'm not a document analyst. I noticed that the second witness signature was inconsistent with the first witness signature in the document's body. The line weight was different. I noted it in case it was relevant." "It was relevant," Helen said. Barnard's analysis confirmed that the second witness signature was added after the original document was completed. The original document had 1 witness. The second was added later, which would have brought it into compliance with the territorial requirement of 2 witnesses for a land transfer. Mara was quiet for a moment. "So the original transfer was not legally valid," she said. "At the time it was executed, a 1-witness transfer was being tested in certain territories. It was subsequently ruled invalid by the Sovereign Court, 2 years after this document's date. The PAC's version suggests they moved to add the second signature after the ruling, but the timing and the analysis of the signature suggest it was added under specific circumstances." Mara thought about her grandmother. She thought about 12 stones on a shelf, and a family reclassified into nothing, and a territory that had then been transferred to the family that had built the stones. "They needed the transfer to be legal," Mara said, "so they made it legal retroactively." "That is what the evidence suggests," Helen said carefully. "And the reclassification of my grandmother, was that in the records too?" Helen looked at her with a precision that was not unkindness, exactly, but was the specific clarity of someone who has learned that giving people the truth directly is more respectful than managing how they receive it. "Yes," she said. "The reclassification documentation is in the archive. It cites 12 registered stones as the basis for the reclassification. The registration records for those 12 stones show the same procedural irregularities as yours. Several of them appear to have been registered in bulk over a short period. The original council members who signed them are deceased, so we cannot interview them, but the records themselves are consistent with the pattern we've found in your case." Mara sat with this information. She let it settle. She had known something like this was in the records. She had found the edges of it herself, but knowing the edges, and having it confirmed as fact, were 2 different experiences. "What happens to the territory?" she said. Helen's expression changed slightly. "That's a more complex question than the records review," she said. "But it falls within the scope of the investigation. It will be part of the formal determination. And my grandmother's reclassification. That is part of the determination too." Mara looked at the documents on the table. She could see the edge of one of them, a page of the archive records, the handwriting visible at the corner. She could read it from here. She did not let herself. "Her Wolf," she said. "If her reclassification is overturned, does that change anything for the inheritance?" There was a brief pause. Something moved in Helen's expression that was not quite her professional neutrality. A fractional shift, a sharpening of attention. "Mara," Helen said, "are you asking whether the overturning of your grandmother's reclassification would affect your own biological assessment?" "Yes," Mara said. Helen picked up a document from the side of the table, not one Mara had brought, but one from the investigation files. She looked at it for a moment without speaking. Then she said, I think that question is one the king should answer directly. I'll arrange for you to speak with him tomorrow. Mara looked at her. The investigation has found things in the archive that go beyond the procedural question, Helen said. I can tell you that much. I'll let him explain the rest. Mara nodded. She left Helen's quarters at full dark and walked back to the kitchen building through the spring night. The air was cool and clean, carrying the smell of the wet earth and the pine trees at the valley's edge. The pack grounds were quiet in the way they always were in the late evening. A few lights in the buildings, the soft sounds of the wind. Ordinary. She thought about her grandmother. She thought about Alara Voss, whose name appeared in the archive as a classified record, now 30 years stale, whose territory had been taken, whose wolf had been officially erased from the pack's accounting. She thought about a woman she had never met who had fought, probably, in whatever way the tools of her time and circumstances permitted, and who had not been enough, not because she was not enough, but because the thing against her had been operating in the full support of the pack's official structures. She thought about the question she had asked Helen. She thought about the answer Helen had not quite given. She thought about the wolf she had been waiting for her whole life, the one that had not come, the one she had stopped expecting sometime around the age of 14, when expectation had started to feel like a cost she could not keep paying. She reached the kitchen door. She stopped, with her hand on the latch. She stood there for a long moment in the dark. She had never told anyone this. Not Arlen, not Grover, not anyone. She had carried it, with the same quiet discipline she carried everything. But in the privacy of the dark and the spring night, she allowed herself to name the specific things she had not let herself feel for years. She had wanted a wolf, not for the status, not for the access and the protection and the rank, simply for itself, for the companion of it, the particular aliveness of being a full thing rather than half of one. She had wanted it the way you want water when you are thirsty, simply and with the whole body, and she had been thirsty for 21 years. She stood at the kitchen door and held this, just for a moment. Then she went inside. Arlen was asleep in her chair by the fire, the way she sometimes fell asleep after the supper hours. Mara put a light blanket over her shoulders without waking her, and went to her bunk and lay down in the dark. She thought about Helen's face when she had said, I think that question is one the king should answer directly. She thought about what could be in the archive that would make that question his to answer. She thought about it for a long time in the dark. Then she put it away, the way she put things away when she needed to sleep, carefully, in the specific part of her mind designated for things that were important and could not yet be resolved, filed precisely and clearly so she could retrieve them whole in the morning. For she slept. She dreamed, which she rarely did in any way she remembered afterward. The dream was not clear or narrative. It was a sensation, a warmth in her chest like something turning, like a key in a lock that had been stiff for a very long time, and the particular held-breath feeling of the moment before something opens. She woke before the rest of the kitchen workers and lay in the gray dawn light and thought about the dream with the careful attention she gave to evidence. She had no conclusions, she only had the feeling, which was imprecise and not useful in any way she could currently measure. But it was the first feeling of that kind she could remember having in a very long time. She got up. She went to the fire. She made the morning bread, because the bread needed to be made regardless of what was coming. And she waited, with the same patience that had carried her this far, for morning. Helen sent a note to the kitchen at mid-morning with a time and a location. The note said, 2 o'clock, the small meeting room at the back of the guest wing. No formal session, no witnesses. Bring the notebook if you have it. Arlen read the note over Mara's shoulder, not intrusively, just with the proximity of someone who had already decided she had a stake in everything that was happening this week, and then said nothing, and handed Mara a clean cloth to wipe her hands on. Mara had the notebook. She always had the notebook. It had been in her coat pocket for so long, it had become part of the coat's weight. She thought of it less as a document, and more as a physical fact, like the worn spots on the boots she had been resoling since she was 17. She arrived at the small meeting room at 5 minutes to 2. The door was open. The room was small, as advertised. A table, 4 chairs, a window that looked onto the inner courtyard of the guest wing. Helen was already there, sitting with a stack of folders. She looked up when Mara came in, and gestured to the chair across the table. The king was not in the room. Mara sat down. She put the notebook on the table, but did not open it. Helen said, straightforwardly, "He'll be here in a few minutes. He's finishing a call with the court's central office." Mara nodded. "While we wait," Helen said, "I want to ask you something that is not formally part of the session, but that will help me understand how to frame the conversation." "All right. When did you decide to send the letters?" Mara looked at Helen's face. It was a question with a genuine purpose behind it, not casual curiosity. Helen was someone who wanted to understand the sequence of events, not because she was suspicious of it, but because she was precise, and a precise understanding required the full picture. "The 8th stone," Mara said. "The one registered the morning the convoy arrived the first time. That was when I was certain I wasn't going to be able to resolve this at a pack level. Not before that. Before that, I was building the record," Mara said. "I needed it to be complete enough to be taken seriously. 1 or 2 stones and a complaint reads as grievance, 8 stones and documented irregularities, and a land transfer and a family history reads as a pattern." Helen made a small note. "And you understood the legal framework. The mandatory review designation. Section 11 of the Territorial Compact," Mara said. "Wolfless pack members can file directly with the sovereign court. The review is mandatory, not discretionary." "Where did you find that?" "The archive. Grover's collection. It was in a footnote of a procedural document from about 80 years ago. It referenced an earlier case, from a different territory, where a similar complaint had been filed, and had resulted in a mandatory review." "Did Grover point you to it?" "No. I found it on my own. Grover leaves materials accessible. He doesn't direct me to specific things." She paused. "I think he's careful about that. Maintaining technical plausible deniability." Helen almost smiled at that. "Almost. That's a very specific reading of his behavior." "I've had 4 years to observe him," Mara said. The door opened. Darian walked in, with the particular unhurried efficiency of someone who has been doing something demanding, and has set it fully aside to do the next thing. He had the same plain coat, different from the formal one, but with the same well-made quality. He looked at the table, at Helen, at Mara, and sat down in the chair beside Helen rather than across from her. The seating arrangement was deliberate, she realized. He was not sitting in the position of an authority figure facing a subject. He was at the table, at an angle. It made the space a different kind of space. "Helen has been thorough," he said, which she understood to mean that Helen had briefed him on the prior evening's conversation. "I'll be direct." "Please," Mara said. He looked at her. He had the same quality of directness he had shown in the hall and in the session, the attention that did not lean on rank to establish itself. "Carol and Pete found something in the archive records yesterday afternoon. It was not in the documents you submitted, because it wasn't in the public section of the archive." Mara waited. "It was in the restricted records," he said. "The Elder Council's private files. They require a court order to access." He paused. "We obtained the order at the beginning of the week." She had not known that. She had not known the court had applied for access to the restricted records. "What did they find?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "Your grandmother's wolf classification. The original, not the amended version. The original. Filed when she was formally assessed at 21. The same age you are now." Mara's hands were very still on the table. She kept them still deliberately. "Alara Voss was classified as a full wolf," he said. "High-ranked. The original assessment put her in the upper tier of the pack's strength accounting." "And then it was changed," Mara said. "It was not a question. The amendment is in the restricted files, dated 2 years after the original, which is around the time the first stones began appearing in her record. The amendment reclassifies her as silenced, a genetic dormancy in the wolf line. It cites the stones as evidence of declining wolf function." He paused. "The amendment was authorized by Elder Renner's predecessor and signed by 2 council members." Mara thought about the 12 stones. She thought about the land transfer with the retroactively added signature. She thought about a family history that was beginning to look less like a series of bad circumstances and more like a constructed collapse, built stone by stone, document by people who had understood that official records could become truth if you worked them carefully enough and long enough. "The reclassification was fabricated," she said. The documentation supporting the reclassification was fabricated, he said carefully. The reclassification itself was based on the fabricated documentation and the registered stones, which we have now determined were procedurally invalid. So yes, Mara was quiet. The window in the meeting room showed the inner courtyard, where the spring sun was falling flat and pale on the flagstone. A bird moved across the corner of the visible sky. The room was very quiet. My mother, she said, she never had a wolf. We're still working through the inheritance documentation, he said. Wolf genetics in suppressed lines is not a simple determination. What I can tell you is that the fabricated reclassification was what established the official family history that your mother was born into, and what you were born into. So my dormancy may not be genetic. It may not be genetic, he confirmed. It may be inherited suppression, a wolf that never developed its call, because the conditions required for that development were removed from your family's record 3 decades ago. He paused. Carol is working with the court's wolf genetics specialist, who is traveling with the convoy. We should have a clearer picture by tomorrow. Mara sat with this. She sat with it the way she sat with everything, with the patient, specific attention she had trained herself to maintain when the information was large, and she needed to receive it clearly and not be carried away by it. The wolf genetics specialist. A clearer picture by tomorrow. She thought about the dream, the warmth in her chest, like something turning, like a key in a stiff lock. She thought about 21 years of waiting for something that had not come. She thought about the word her family had carried, silenced, and how completely she had accepted it, not because she was naive or unintelligent, but because it was in every official record and had been endorsed by every authority, in the only world she had ever known. She thought about her grandmother, about Elara Voss, who had been a high-ranked wolf, officially, in a document that had been buried in a restricted file for 30 years. Is there a way to know, she said, what it would take, if my dormancy is suppressed rather than genetic? Is there a way to call it? He looked at her. Helen had gone still on the other side of the table. Yes, he said. The legal act of restoring a suppressed classification, what I did in the Hall of Weights with the 9th stone, carries specific ceremonial weight under sovereign law. It's not just a declaration. It's a formal restoration of record. The court's position is that when a classification was fabricated, the act of formally nullifying the fabrication restores the original state. She looked at him. She looked at the careful language he was using, and thought about what it meant underneath it. You're saying, she said slowly, that when you declared the 9th stone and formally nullified the false record, you may have already initiated the restoration. That is what the sovereign law holds, he said. Yes. She sat with this for a moment that was longer than most moments. Then she said, Is that why? He looked at her. He understood the question. She could see that he understood it. I declared the 9th stone because the situation warranted it, he said. Because 8 fabricated stones and a 3-decade family suppression warranted it under any reasonable reading of sovereign law. I didn't declare it to initiate the restoration. A pause. But you knew it would, she said. He held her gaze. Yes, he said. I knew it was possible. Mara breathed. She thought about what it meant that he had known, that standing in the Hall of Weights in front of the full pack, he had said those words knowing what they might initiate, not as a performance, not as a symbolic gesture, but as a specific legal act, with a specific legal consequence. Knowing that a wolfless girl who had been carrying 8 fabricated stones might, as a result of those words, have something returned to her that should never have been taken. She had thought, in the Hall of Weights, that she had not been prepared for it. She understood now that she had been right. She had not been prepared for the specific thing it actually was. She said, very quietly, Thank you. He said nothing. He looked at her for a moment, and then he looked at the table, and the silence that followed had a quality that was not empty. It was the specific silence of something acknowledged. Helen cleared her throat gently. There's more from the investigation, she said. Do you want to continue? Mara looked at her notebook on the table. She thought about the 4 years inside it. She thought about being 14 years old and watching an elder write nothing on a blank page while she stood across from him with a bruise on her arm. She thought about the first stone and the ceremonial field and Colt's theatrical voice asking the crowd to be entertained. She thought about standing in the hall of weights at 5 in the morning, looking at 8 stones with her name on them, and thinking, not yet, but someday. Yes, she said. Continue. They worked for 2 more hours, going through the investigation's findings systematically. Helen presented. Mara clarified and confirmed. Darian listened. The picture that assembled itself across the table was complete and damning in the way that precise documentation of a long-running injustice tends to be. Not dramatic, but irrefutable. The Renner family's involvement with the Voss family's decline stretched back across 2 generations. It was documented in land records, stone registrations, classification amendments, and a witness signature added to a document that hadn't had one originally because the transfer hadn't been legal. By the time they finished, the light through the courtyard window had moved into late afternoon, the long slanted light of a spring evening. Helen began organizing the documents into their proper order for the formal determination. Mara closed her notebook and looked at it on the table. She picked it up. She put it in her coat pocket. She stood to go. Darian stood at the same time. He said, very simply, "Get some rest tonight." She looked at him. "Is tomorrow significant?" "The determination will be formally issued," he said. "The Wolf genetic specialist will have finished her assessment, and Elder Renner's formal response is due in the morning." She nodded. "All right." She was at the door when he said, in a tone that was not quite his official voice, and not quite his ordinary voice, but something that sat between the two. "The inventory you completed the morning we arrived." She turned. "I was told you went back inside the storehouse and finished it before coming to tell Cook Arlen we were there," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I was in the middle of it." "Yes," he said, and he almost smiled. Not quite, but the adjacency to it was visible. "Good night." She walked back to the kitchen through the spring evening, and for the first time in she could not remember how long, she did not feel like she was walking through a place that had decided what she was without her input. The grounds were the same. The trees were the same. The smell of the kitchen was the same when she pushed open the door and Arlen looked up from the evening pot. But she was not entirely the same. She felt it in the way you feel a change in weather, not yet arrived but coming, close, the air before a storm. Except this storm was not threatening. It was the kind of storm you stand and face because you know it will clear the air, because you know the morning after it will be different from any morning before. Arlen looked at her face and put down her spoon. "Sit down," she said. Mara sat down. Arlen poured her tea without asking. She set it on the table and went back to the pot. Mara sat with the tea in both hands and let the warmth of the kitchen settle around her, and thought about tomorrow. The determination, the formal findings, Elder Renner's response, whatever the Wolf genetic specialist had found in 30 years of suppressed classification documentation. She thought about what Darian had said, about restoration, about sovereign law and what it held and what it meant when the record was formally corrected. And she thought about the dream, the warmth in her chest, the key in the lock, the held breath moment before something opened. She put her hands around the cup and she breathed in the smell of the kitchen. Bread and fire, and the familiar, particular, ordinary reality of a place she had lived her whole life in service to. And she thought, tomorrow. She thought, it is almost time. She did not sleep well. She had not expected to. She lay in her bunk in the small hours of the morning and listened to the breathing of the other kitchen workers around her, the sound of the wind in the eaves, the occasional creak of the building's old timber settling in the night. The kitchen building was the oldest structure in Silvercrest, Arlen had told her once. Older than the main hall, older than the record buildings. It had been here through floods and droughts, and the silent year, and 3 changes in leadership. It would be here, after whatever happened today, whatever form it took. She held on to this fact in a vague and comforting way, the way you hold on to a fixed point when the things around you are moving. She was not afraid. Exactly. Fear in the traditional sense had never been her predominant response to difficulty. What she had instead was a heightened alertness, a sharpening of all her attention to the specific facts of where she was and what was coming. This was the state she entered, in moments of consequence, and it was, she had learned, both useful and exhausting. It made her precise. It also made rest impossible. She got up well before the dawn. She made the fire. She started the bread. She measured the water and the grain by feel in the dark, the way she had done it hundreds of times, and the familiar motions were steadying, in the way familiar motions always were, anchoring her to the specific reality of the moment through her hands. Arlen came in, while the first loaves were going in, and said nothing about the hour. She put on her own apron, and began preparing the morning porridge, and they worked in the dark kitchen together, with the fire growing, and the smell of the bread beginning to fill the space. At some point, Arlen said, without looking up from the pot, "How are you feeling?" Mara thought about it. "I feel like someone about to sit an examination on a subject they have studied thoroughly, and for which they are prepared," she said. Arlen stirred the porridge. But it is still an examination," Mara said. Arlen nodded. "That's honest," she said. The morning meal was ordinary. The pack ate. The kitchen crew served. Mara moved through the routine as she always did, and the routine held her the way a frame holds a canvas, giving the morning a shape it could inhabit without falling apart. The formal determination was scheduled for 10 in the morning. At 9:30, Helen sent a note that said, "Come to the main hall at 9:45. There will be a brief session before the public determination. Bring the notebook." She came with the notebook in her coat pocket. Arlen came too, without being asked, as she had every time now. Grover was already outside the main hall when they arrived, standing near the door with his hands folded, and his usual archival patience visible in the way he had arranged himself to wait. Helen was inside with the court specialist, whose name was Dr. Vera Lund. Dr. Lund was a compact woman, perhaps 60 years old, with very clear eyes, and the bearing of someone whose professional life had been built on making precise assessments of things other people found difficult to assess. She was seated at the table with a document in front of her, and she looked up when Mara came in, with the specific attention of someone who has been thinking about a case for a day and a half, and is ready to discuss it directly. Helen said, "Dr. Lund has completed her review. I thought you should hear the findings before the formal session, so you have time to process them." Mara sat down. Dr. Lund said, without preamble, "I've reviewed the classification documentation for your grandmother, your mother, and your own assessment records. I've also reviewed the records for 3 other family lines that went through the reclassification process, under the same elder administration, to give me a comparison framework." Mara nodded. "Ilara Voss was a full wolf," Dr. Lund said. "Her original assessment at 21 placed her in the highest third of the pack's strength accounting. The reclassification document that superseded this assessment was not medically supported. There are no case notes, no secondary assessment, no physical examination record, which would have been standard practice for a reclassification of that significance. It was an administrative document, not a medical one. It cited the stone records and the word of 2 council members, neither of whom had any medical qualification." Mara said nothing. She listened. "Wolf dormancy in a family line is not a simple binary," Dr. Lund continued. "There is genetic dormancy, a heritable trait that results in successive generations without wolves, which is permanent and cannot be reversed by record correction. And there is what I would call circumstantial dormancy, a wolf that does not develop its full call in conditions where the developmental environment has been compromised. This is less common, but it is documented." "Compromised by what?" Mara said. "Historically, by severe environmental disruption, prolonged stress, isolation from pack community at critical developmental periods, or in some documented cases, by the sustained experience of formal social rejection." Dr. Lund paused. "By being told, officially and repeatedly, that you do not have something, some way being categorized, in the official records of your community, as someone who is absent of a specific quality." Mara was very still. "The research is not entirely settled," Dr. Lund said. "But the documented cases I've reviewed show a pattern that is consistent with what I see in your family's history. A wolf that exists biologically but has not developed its call because the conditions, social, relational, environmental, required for that call never existed." Mara thought about 21 years of being walked past, of stones and silence, and the particular invisibility of someone who has been officially classified as less. She thought about Arlen, and the kindnesses that came through logistics rather than words, the small warmth of being taught rather than simply used. She thought about what it meant to have your existence made official, not just ignored, but formally, by record, by stone, by the signature of an elder on an administrative document. So when the king declared the 9th stone, she said. The formal restoration of your family's classification under sovereign law removed the official basis for the categorization that your family has carried for 30 years, Dr. Lund said. The environmental condition has changed. Whether that initiates a change in the biological condition as well is something that cannot be predicted precisely, but the cases I've reviewed suggest it is possible. Mara looked at the document in front of Dr. Lund. She could see her own name on it at the top. When, she said, if it happens, is there a timeline? Days, Dr. Lund said. Sometimes weeks. The cases show a range, and it is not guaranteed. I want to be honest with you about that. The research is not definitive. It is simply the best information I can give you. Mara nodded. She sat with this for a moment. She sat with the precise and specific weight of what she had just been told. Not with hope, exactly, because hope was too large and imprecise a thing for a moment that required precision. She sat with it the way she sat with evidence, carefully, without distorting it, letting it be exactly what it was. Then she said, "Thank you." Dr. Lund nodded. Helen made a notation. The formal determination session began at 10. The main hall was full in the way it had been for the other sessions, perhaps fuller. Mara took her place in the general attendance area with Arlen and Grover. Oren was at the back of the platform. Helen was at the table. The king was in his position at the side wall. The elder Renner was at the respondents' table. Colt was not beside him. Colt's chair was empty. The absence of Colt from the session created a low, running murmur through the crowd before the session was called to order. Mara noted it. She noted that Elder Renner's composure this morning was different from the previous sessions, still technically maintained, but thinner. The performance was showing its effort now in a way it had not before. Helen called the session to order and began reading the court's formal determination. It was long. It was specific. It cited every relevant finding in the order of its significance, from the procedural violations in the stone registrations, to the amended dates, to the fabricated reclassification documentation, to the land transfer's retroactively added signature. Helen's voice was even and clear throughout, moving through each element with the steady efficiency of someone completing an important task correctly. Elder Renner's formal response, submitted in writing that morning, accepted the court's findings regarding the stone procedural violations and the amended registration dates. It did not accept the finding regarding the reclassification documentation, asserting that the administrative actions of the previous Elder Council were within their authority, and that the court's retrospective review exceeded its jurisdiction. Helen read this response into the record, and then said, calmly, that the court's position was that the Sovereign Compact's jurisdiction over classification documentation was explicit and not subject to local interpretation. She cited 3 specific provisions of the Compact. Then she said that the formal determination issued by the Sovereign Court was as follows. The hall was absolutely quiet. The 8 stones registered under Mara Voss's name in the Hall of Weights were formally nullified in their entirety. All procedural violations documented and registered. The Hall of Weights records for Silvercrest were placed under a court review period of 12 months, during which all new registrations required court oversight. The reclassification of Ilara Voss was formally reversed. The original classification, as documented in the restricted archive, was restored to the official sovereign record. This restoration applied to the family line under sovereign law. The land transfer document was referred for formal legal review under the Territorial Compact's provisions for improperly executed transfers. Pending the outcome of that review, the territory in question was placed under a sovereign administration hold, removing it from the Renner family's management authority. Colt Renner was formally stripped of the Beta title, effective immediately, for violation of Hall of Weights charter and court record tampering. His restriction from PAC leadership positions was entered into the sovereign record for a period of 5 years. Elder Renner was referred for formal tribunal proceedings. Helen put the document down. The hall was so quiet that Mara could hear the spring wind outside, and the particular way it moved through the pine trees at the territory's edge. Then, in the silence, something happened that she had not expected. It was not dramatic. She had braced for dramatic because that was what she knew to brace for. But this was quiet. It was barely anything. It was a warmth in her chest, starting low and building slowly, like a fire being built from embers rather than from a struck match. She had felt something like it in the dream, She had felt something like it the morning after the Hall of Weights session, standing at the kitchen door in the dark. She stood very still in the general attendance area of the main hall of Silvercrest, with Arlen on her left and Grover on her right, and the spring light coming through the tall windows, and the Sovereign Court's determination still hanging in the air like a change in weather, and she felt it. The warmth, the specific aliveness of something waking up that had never woken before. She did not let anything show on her face. This was not because she was suppressing it. It was because what was happening was private and enormous, and she needed to be alone with it before it could be anything else. She felt Arlen go still beside her, with the alertness of someone who has known a person for years and can read the quality of their stillness. Mara said, very quietly and without looking at Arlen, "I need to go outside." Arlen said, equally quietly, "Go." She walked out of the main hall through the side door and into the spring day, and kept walking until she was at the edge of the grounds, where the practice field met the tree line, and the pine trees were thick enough to give her a private space. She walked into the trees a little way, just enough to be out of the sight line of the buildings, and she stopped. She stood still. The warmth in her chest was larger now. It was not comfortable exactly. It was the specific discomfort of something expanding, inside a space that had been built for it, but had been empty for so long that the expansion was at once right and startling. She thought about Dr. Lund. Days, sometimes weeks. It is not guaranteed. She thought about her grandmother, Ilara Voss, restored to the sovereign record today, after 30 years of official erasure. She thought about her mother, who had waited her whole life in the same silence Mara had lived in, and who had died in it. She thought, "I wish you were here. Both of you." She thought this with the specific grief of someone who cannot go back, and can only carry what should have been theirs forward. Then the warmth in her chest turned, and she caught her breath. It was not pain. It was the opposite of pain. It was the feeling of a door that had been sealed for 21 years opening, not crashing open, not violently, but with the particular slow certainty of something that has found its moment and will not be stopped now. She pressed one hand flat against her sternum, and she stood very still. She breathed. The trees around her were spring new, their needles the particular bright green of growth that hasn't hardened yet. The light came through them in long, thin bars. The wind moved through the high branches with the sound it always made, the sound that was the same sound she had heard from the kitchen building her entire life. Everything around her was the same. She was not. She stood in the trees for a long time. Find. She was not sure how long. Time had stopped moving in its usual measured way. Eventually she heard a footstep on the needle-covered ground behind her. She knew it was not Arlen. Arlen's step was heavier and purposeful. This step was quiet and deliberate in a different way. She did not turn around immediately. She gave herself one more breath. Then she turned. Darian was standing at the edge of the trees, outside their cover, in the open spring light. He looked at her face without speaking. Whatever he saw there, he held quietly, the way he held everything. "Helen told me you left the hall," he said. "I needed a moment," she said. He nodded. He did not move closer or offer to leave. He simply stood there, with the particular quality of presence she had first noticed in the east yard, the stillness that did not demand anything of the space it occupied. She looked at him and thought about everything the past week had been, and everything that was still coming, and everything that would happen now in the days and months and eventual legal proceedings that would eventually resolve into something that looked like justice, but would always also be the knowledge of what should have been and wasn't, for 30 years and 2 generations. She thought about all of that, and then she thought about a warmth in her chest that was still turning, still expanding, still finding its full shape in the space she had kept for it, her whole life, without knowing what she was keeping it for. "Something is happening," she said. It was not quite the right way to say it, but it was the most accurate thing she had. He looked at her. "Yes," he said simply. "I know." She did not ask how he knew. She thought she understood. He had known it was possible, from the moment he declared the 9th stone. He had known it, and he had declared it anyway, and he was standing at the edge of the trees now in the spring afternoon, not because Helen had sent him to retrieve her from the grounds, but because he had wanted to be present. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at the trees, and breathed in the spring air, and felt the warmth in her chest, and stood in the knowledge of what was coming, with the full and patient attention of someone who has spent her entire life becoming the specific person required for this particular moment. She was ready. It happened on a Wednesday night, 11 days after the formal determination. Not in ceremony, not with an audience, not in the way the awakening ceremony was performed, with its formal circle, and its elder speeches, and its crowd of witnesses, dressed in their best clothes. It happened in the ordinary dark, in the way most real things happen, quietly and without announcement, as though the universe understood that the moment did not need spectacle to be significant. Mara was in the practice field behind the kitchen building. She had been going there in the evenings since the determination session, in the hour between the end of the kitchen work and the beginning of dark. Not to wait for anything specifically, or perhaps to wait, but the kind of waiting that does not look like waiting from the outside. Active, present, the waiting of a person who has created the right conditions and is simply continuing to exist within them. She had done this for 10 nights. Each night, the warmth in her chest had been there, larger than the night before, more specific in its location, more distinct in its quality. She had told no one except Arlen, in 3 words at the end of a very long day. "It's getting closer." And Arlen had looked at her and gone back to the pot and said, "Then eat a proper supper tonight," which was Arlen's way of expressing more than she had words for. On the 11th night, she was standing at the far edge of the practice field, where the grass gave way to the dirt track that the warriors used for endurance runs, and the lights of the main buildings were visible at a distance through the spring dark. The warmth in her chest was different tonight. It had been building, night by night, with the gradual accumulation of something that had been building its whole life. Tonight it did not feel like building, it felt like arriving. She stood in the dark and breathed, and thought about her grandmother, and her mother, and 21 years of silence that had not been silence at all, but the space held open for something that had been coming all along, that had never been absent, only waiting for the official record to acknowledge what was real. She thought about the king, who had stood at the edge of the trees and said, "I know," who had left the next morning with the convoy, because the circuit continued regardless of what had been discovered, and who had sent a formal communication through the court system 2 days after departure, stating that the full investigation would continue through the legal channels, and that Mara should contact the court directly, if further documentation was required. The formal communication had been addressed to her, not to the Pack Council, not to Arlen as a representative. Directly to her, at the kitchen building, with her name on the outside in the administrative clerk's standard hand. She had read it twice, and put it in the notebook and gone back to work. She had thought about the edge of the trees. She had thought about it in the intervals of ordinary days, with the particular restraint of someone who understands that the thing she is thinking about belongs in a different category from the things she is currently managing. She stood in the practice field on the 11th night and thought about none of this. Specifically, she was thinking about the warmth and the dark and the way the spring air smelled, and then she was not thinking at all. It is difficult to describe what happened next in the ordinary language of events. The experience of a wolf first coming through is not something that has a precise vocabulary outside the communities that experience it. What Mara would understand of it afterward, talking to Dr. Lund through the court's communication system a week later, was that the experience was consistent with the documented cases of circumstantial dormancy resolving, sudden and complete rather than gradual, like a light turning on rather than growing from a dim source. What she experienced in the moment was the warmth in her chest reaching its full size, and then something shifting in the quality of the dark around her, and then something looking back at her from inside herself, with a presence that was both entirely her own and entirely other. Ancient, patient, enormous, and furious, with a fury that was not destructive, but was the specific fury of something that had been held still for too long, and was now, finally, free to move. She stood in the practice field, and felt the world go very bright despite the dark, and breathed, and let it be what it was. She did not wake anyone. She stood in the field for a long time. She stood, until the experience became part of her, rather than something happening to her, until she could distinguish the new quality of her own aliveness from the strangeness of its arrival, until it was simply hers. Then she walked back to the kitchen building, and sat on the step outside the door, and looked at the sky for a while. Arlen found her there in the morning, before the dawn, when she came out to bring more wood to the kitchen fire. She looked at Mara, sitting on the step. She looked at Mara's face. She set the wood down. She sat down on the step beside her. They sat together for a few minutes in the pre-dawn quiet, the sky going slowly from black to a dark and saturated blue at the edges. Then Arlen said, "Well?" Mara said, "Yes." They sat for another moment. "Are you hungry?" Arlen said. "Yes," Mara said. "Actually, yes." Arlen stood up and went inside. Mara sat for one more minute on the step, in the last of the dark, and let herself feel the specific extraordinary reality of a Wednesday morning that was different from every morning before it, and also completely ordinary, and both of those things at the same time. Then she got up and went inside and helped make the breakfast. The formal report to the court was filed by Dr. Lund 3 days later, after Mara allowed the assessment that Dr. Lund had requested through the court's communication system. The assessment was thorough and professional, and generated a significant amount of documentation. Mara sat through it with her usual patience, and answered every question accurately. Dr. Lund's report confirmed the resolution of circumstantial dormancy. It was entered into the court record as a documented case, with all identifying information protected under sovereign privacy provisions. The case would be referenced in future assessments with the identifying details removed, because it was apparently unusual enough to be useful to the field. The legal proceedings that followed the determination session were not fast. She had not expected them to be. The tribunal for Elder Renner began in the summer and ran through the autumn. Colt's restriction was entered into the record, and he left Silvercrest in May, which the pack received with a range of responses from visible relief to complicated silence. The territory review proceeded through the court's legal apparatus at the measured pace of an investigation involving 30-year-old documents and a complex chain of ownership questions. Mara was not waiting for it to resolve before living her life. She had spent 4 years waiting. She had become very good at it, but she had also spent 4 years understanding that waiting was not the same as living, and that the distinction mattered. She stayed in the kitchen through the summer. She worked and she ran the inventory, and she borrowed things from Grover's archive. She began to understand, slowly, and in the practical and undramatic way of someone who does not hurry revelations, that she was different in her body, in a specific way now, stronger, more aware, faster to recover from a long day's work, and that this difference was simply part of what she was now, and could be integrated without making it into a large thing. She corresponded with the court. Helen was the primary contact, brisk and organized, through the court's formal communication network. Occasionally a note came from Barnard about a document question. Once, in June, a note came from Dr. Lund about a follow-up question for the case file. In July, a note came that was not from any of them. It was from the King's administrative office, which was how his correspondence was routed. Through the office, formally addressed, on the court's standard stationery. It was about the territory review. It provided a specific update on the legal status of the South Quarter and the projected timeline for the formal transfer determination. It was a professional communication. It was also 3 paragraphs longer than it needed to be to convey the relevant information. She read it twice. She noticed the 3 extra paragraphs. She noticed that the third one asked, very specifically, how the investigation was progressing from her perspective, which was a question that the administrative office did not typically ask, and that implied the note had been drafted with more than administrative input. She wrote back. She answered the questions about the territory review precisely. She also wrote, in a paragraph she revised 4 times before sending, that the spring had been productive, and that the pack's adjustment to the court oversight period had been, in her observation, largely positive. She did not mention anything else. She sent the note through the court's communication network. A response came within the week. It addressed the territory review, and also contained a paragraph about a case in the Northern Circuit that had generated a precedent relevant to her family's land history. It was specific and legally detailed. At the end of it was a single sentence that said, "I hope the summer is treating you well." She sat with that sentence for a moment. Then she wrote it down in her notebook, in the back pages, where she kept things that mattered, in a different way from evidence. The summer moved into autumn. The South Quarter territory was formally transferred from the Renner Family Management Authority in September, pending the final determination, which was expected in the following year. The interim management was assigned to a court-appointed administrator. Elder Renner's tribunal concluded in October. The findings were entered into the sovereign record. Elder Renner was removed from the Elder Council, and his family's management authority over pack resources was restricted for a period of 10 years. The pack received this with the specific quiet of a community that has been organized around a particular kind of power for a long time, and is learning, cautiously and uncertainly, to organize itself without it. It was not a smooth process. It was not always peaceful. There were people in Silvercrest who had genuinely believed the Renner family's version of events, and whose adjustment to the court's determination was uncomfortable and slow. Mara did not expect otherwise. She understood that changing 30 years of official narrative was different from changing what people had experienced as the truth of their lives. She worked and she waited, and she was patient, because those were the tools she had. In November, the convoy's circuit brought it back to the Southern Territories. Silvercrest was not on the official schedule. It was not a visit that had been listed in the court's published circuit plan. Oren arrived at the kitchen building on a Tuesday morning. She had a specific feeling about Tuesdays now, she thought, which was probably irrational, and said that the convoy was passing through on its way to the next territory stop and would be halting for the evening. She put on her clean coat. She walked out to the outer grounds where the convoy had pulled in, and he was standing at the front of it, in the same gray coat. The autumn light was different from the spring light, lower, more golden, landing on the grounds at an angle that made everything look more specific than usual. He saw her before she reached the convoy. He did not look surprised, because he had known she was here. He had been stopping here because she was here. They were both aware of this without discussing it. She came up to where he was standing and stopped. "The territory review is going well," she said, because she always led with what was concrete. "Yes," he said. "Helen's update was positive. I also read your note about the Northern precedent. It seemed relevant," he said. "It was relevant," she said, "and also 3 paragraphs long." He looked at her. Something moved in his expression that was the adjacency to a smile again, which she had seen twice now, and which she was beginning to understand was his particular version of one. "You counted the paragraphs," he said. "I count things," she said. They stood in the autumn light for a moment. The convoy was being settled behind him. Oren was overseeing it with his usual efficient quiet. Arlen was visible at the kitchen building door. Mara thought about her notebook. She thought about 4 years of small and precise entries. She thought about the packed specificity of a life lived in the margins of someone else's structure, learning everything there was to learn from the position of the overlooked, collecting information the way you collect stones, one at a time, without knowing yet what you are building. She thought about 8 stones with her name on them, one word written in chalk on a blank one, by a man who had read her letter at the bottom of a courier stack and added her territory to his circuit. She thought about a wolf that had spent 21 years waiting for the conditions required for its call, and a man who had understood what those conditions needed and had used the specific authority he had to create them. She thought about this, and then she stopped thinking about it, because some things did not need to be fully articulated to be understood. She said. "How long is the convoy halting?" "The evening," he said. "We move out in the morning." She nodded. "Then, you should come to the kitchen for supper," she said. "Arlen's cooking is better than whatever the convoy has been eating." He looked at her for a moment. "That is probably true," he said. "It is definitely true," she said. She turned and walked back toward the kitchen, and she did not look back, because she did not need to. She could hear his footsteps on the autumn ground behind her, even and unhurried, keeping her pace. She thought about what came next. The territory determination in the spring. The tribunal's final record. The long and complicated work of a pack rebuilding itself around a structure that was more honest than the previous one, which was work that would not be finished for years, and would require patience and clarity, and the specific stubbornness of someone who has learned that important things take as long as they take. She thought about her grandmother's restored name in the sovereign record. She thought about her mother, whose quiet life she carried with her in the specific way you carry people who did not get to see the thing they deserve to see, as a reason, as a direction, as the weight that makes you walk straighter and faster than you would walk for yourself alone. She thought about a wolf that was now entirely and permanently hers, that had always been hers, that had simply waited for someone to state what was true. She pushed open the kitchen door. The warmth of the fire came out to meet her. Arlen looked up from the stove with the unsurprised expression of someone who had been expecting exactly this, for reasons she was too precise to articulate and too wise to need to. "Two for supper," Mara said. Warlen looked at the door, where the king of the sovereign territory was stopping to remove his boots, with the practical care of someone entering a kitchen where the floor was clean. She looked at Mara. She picked up the ladle. "Sit down," she said. "It's almost ready." Mara sat down. The fire was warm, the kitchen smelled of bread and winter herbs, and the particular comfort of a space that had held her for 21 years, and would hold her differently now, not as a refuge but as a place she had chosen, and would continue to choose. Not because she had nowhere else to go, but because going back to the place that was yours, on your own terms and in full knowledge of what you were going back to, was a different thing entirely from staying because you had no options. She thought about options. She had more of them now than she had ever had. She was learning to live inside that in the careful and unhurried way she had learned everything else. The man who had carried the 9th stone sat down across from her. He looked at the kitchen the way he had looked at everything she had seen him look at, with the full and genuine attention of someone who found the specific details of a space more interesting than a general impression of it. Arlen put 2 bowls on the table. The outside, the autumn evening was coming down over Silvercrest in shades of orange and purple, and the Pax lights were coming on one by one in the windows of the buildings, and the territory that had been her family's before the stones was waiting in its autumn quiet for the determination that would give it back. Mara picked up her spoon. She breathed in the smell of the kitchen, and she thought, quietly and with the full and honest weight of everything it meant, "I am still here. I am still here. And now everything is different." She was right about all 3 of those things.